If there was one thing that hadn't changed in over 100 years, it was a bar. Yukimaru swirled the hot sake in his cup contemplatively. The drink was, objectively, terrible. But at least it didn't remind him of the war the way finer sake would've. That Urahara was a total packrat who stockpiled the strangest things, okay. And he knew for a fact everybody had gotten into his liquor stores once or twice, especially as the years marched on inexorably with no clear end in sight, and life became a case of either drinking yourself into a stupor, or giving up altogether. Suzuki Ichigo, back then, had his family, his sisters and a few human friends, and his ridiculous optimism, but him? Yukimaru would admit to himself, in the recesses of his mind, that what fueled him was more like pure spite. He simply refused to give Aizen the satisfaction. Defiance. His Zanpakuto spirit was absolutely right, both in that this was his most defining trait, and that it was probably what would have gotten him killed if Inao hadn't done her miracle rejection thing. Had in fact gotten him killed more than once when he was just too stubborn to retreat when it was called, relying on his Vasto Lord regeneration and the fact that no one had yet figured out how to kill a Zanpakuto spirit. His life was, their lives were, kind of a cosmic joke at this point. A half-Quincy with Shinigami powers, who somehow managed to get his own Zanpakuto spirit first holofeed, and then rankerized. And now the Quincy was dead, so he probably qualified as a Shinigami with Quincy powers, while that former Zanpakuto spirit now had his very own Zanpakuto spirit. What could he say? It was getting damn crowded in King's Head. Yukimaru snorted and took another sip of his drink. It wasn't his first time at this particular izakaya, although he wasn't a regular patron either, given that it was straddling the border between Kusajishi and Zaraki, over a dozen districts away from where he normally lived. Most innkeepers appreciated having someone handy with both a hammer and his fists drop by now, and then keep the inn in decent repair, and the ruffians in check. In return, Yukimaru was free to hang around the bar, as long as he didn't go overboard with the sake and food. This far out in Rukengai, nobody gave a damn about nobles or Shinigami politics or that kind of rubbish. He could do whatever he liked, eat however much he liked, and it wouldn't get anyone else in trouble. It was kind of freeing. He dropped the last chicken bone back onto the plate, where it clattered up against the demolished remains of the bird. Suzuki had better turn up with the food he'd been promising to deliver soon, or Yukimaru was going to harken back to his hollow roots and eat him. He didn't remember much of his earliest hollow days before he gained cognizance, but being hungry all the time was hard to forget, and even harder to stomach now that he knew what it was like to be full. And it wasn't like he could help having more ryatsu than the average captain nowadays. He was going to have to switch rivers soon. The usual streams nearest his house were running low on fish. Speaking of emptiness, the izakaya was weirdly quiet at this time of the day. Yukimaru licked the grease from his fingers, giving the interior of the bar another quick sweep over. Usually by late afternoon, it would already have started filling up with men fresh from a day's labors, but now it was already well into the evening, and the izakaya was still mostly empty. Even the innkeeper was starting to get concerned. Yukimaru could see him look up more and more frequently from his place by the counter, as though he could have somehow missed the entrance of a horde of boisterous, burly men all loudly demanding drinks. As though summoned, there was a sudden commotion at the door. Yukimaru's nose twitched, his gaze sharpening immediately. Blood. Several men stumbled and drunkenly, no, not drunk, injured, cloths poorly wrapped over still bleeding gashes, blood and dirt matting their hair. One of them called loudly for sake. The innkeeper hurried to obey, throwing a furtive look back at Yukimaru, as though trying to reassure himself that he had backup. If someone brought a fight into the izakaya, also not an uncommon occurrence around here, then it would be his job to kick the whole lot of them out. He eyed the men again. They didn't look like they were spoiling for a fight, they looked like they were there to forget. Does it matter? One of them was saying loudly, as the innkeeper carried out fresh cups of hot sake. Sunen's gone anyway. Yukimaru frowned. Sunen? Who or what was that? The sound of something shattering caught his attention before he could think on that further, and he looked around to see the innkeeper with his tray braced against one of the tables. There was a cup on the floor, now in 1,000 pieces, liquid seeping into the floorboards. Sunen Ika's gone, whispered the innkeeper. All of them? He'd had one hand on the table, ready to intervene if any of the men decided to take offense to that act of clumsiness. But the phrasing gave him pause. Sunen Ika, a Yakuza gang. Briefly, his mind went to Zaraki Kenpachi, because if anything 4 years in Rukengai had taught him, it was that there were a lot fewer people that could take out an entire gang than history would have led them to believe. But no, the timing was all wrong. Maybe an Ohana. Didn't she spend a lot of time in these few districts back in the day? None of the men even got up from their seats or made threatening gestures at the innkeeper for delaying their drinks, which was honestly a first Yukimaru had ever seen. Whoever the Tsunin had been, they must have been big fish around these parts. All gone, agreed the men, picking up their drinks and knocking them back. From his angle, Yukimaru could just barely see the innkeeper close his eyes, his lips moving like a quiet curse or prayer. What happened? Bless the human insatiable propensity for gossip. Couldn't get near that crazy house, one of them muttered. Bastard didn't even face us like a man, said another, and they all spat. Total death trap, everyone agreed. Yukimaru put his cup down, slowly. That sounded like something worth investigating. Finding the death trap proved easier than he'd expected. All Yukimaru had to do was follow the literal trail of dead bodies. Soul Society was a funny place. Sometimes bodies disappeared immediately after death, broken down into Raizhi. But more often than not they stayed around for a few days. Urahara probably had his theories as to why, but Yukimaru didn't really care. That one had a weird pattern of lacerations. Yukimaru crouched down to examine it better. Offhand, he didn't know of any wards that could produce a pattern like that, but he was hardly a Kaido expert. And it wasn't like he had a camera phone handy. Sometimes he did miss living in the 21st century. From the outside, the house didn't seem very threatening. In fact, it was probably too kind to call it a house. It was more like a shack, a dilapidated wooden thing that looked like a strong wind would knock it over. Yukimaru closed his eyes, stretching out his senses. Ryatsu sensing had always come easier to him than to Tsuzuki, again. He didn't really care as to why. No, really, Urahara, save your breath. His eyes flashed open, and it was all he could do to stop himself from physically taking a step backwards. He'd no idea what he was expecting, but it wasn't this. Oh, Death Trap was a good name for it, all right. He knew nothing about Kaido, but even then it was hard to miss the fact that these wards were laid by a true master. A filamentous meshwork lattice of spells tied together, like the web of some giant spider awaiting its next victim. He'd only ever seen this level of complexity once, and it wasn't even him, it was Ichigo. Ichigo, who had been getting a full tour of Urahara Shoten, back when they'd first started turning it into their headquarters, after Soul Society had ceased to exist. Yukimaru was suddenly very, very awake. He didn't think there was anybody nearby, though he could always be wrong. Just because Ryatsu sensing came more naturally to him didn't mean he could escape all the problems that Suzuki faced, and he wasn't any better at picking out people hiding under Ryatsu concealing cloaks. To be fair, though, even Aizen couldn't pick up people hiding under Ryatsu concealing cloaks. Cautiously, he closed his eyes again, stretching out his senses as far as he could manage. But nothing alive pinged on his radar. He opened his eyes again. Well, there was one easy way to test a Kaido barrier. Yukimaru picked up a stone, hefted it in the palm of his hand, and then threw it as hard as he could at the shack. The stone clattered against the wooden boards, and then dropped to the ground with a soft thud. Nothing else happened. Damn. He tapped his free hand against his thigh, trying to dredge up those faraway memories. Urahara's wards had lit up like a kaleidoscope of nebulae when Ichigo had done that, so bright that they were visible even to the naked eye. Yukimaru highly doubted anyone could, at this point in time, manage better wards than something woven by 3 Kaido masters. So the lack of response meant, ugh. He had no idea what it meant, and there was no Urahara conveniently nearby to needle for answers. Stupid Getaboshi, he muttered. Never there when you actually need him. Well, there was nothing to be gained from standing around. The interesting thing about wards was that they had to be tripped before they'd take effect, and no Kaido master he'd ever met had used a basic wall ward, because they were, paradoxically, the easiest to crack. Urahara has preferred a web-like structure not unlike a fishnet. Aizen had used overlapping layers, like an onion. Tesai had sunk pillars well into the bedrock, wrapping both the layers and the nets these pillars. It had been an eclectic mess, almost psychedelic to the sight, but it also kept the fortress safe from Aizen. Even though the megalomaniac had more Ryatsu than the 3 of them put together in a never-ending army. Yukimaru shook his head, bemused. Apparently, some of Urahara's ramblings about tensile strength and whatnot had sunk in, after all. Who asked Ichigo to actually sit through those, instead of finding flimsy excuses to leave the room like everyone sane had. Man, not even Yoruichi had liked Urahara that much. He swept his gaze over the scattered corpses one more time, walking sideways around the shack. Judging by their positions, the route through the wards should be here, he said aloud, and took a step forwards. Nothing happened. Well, that was a good sign. Squeezing his eyes shut, he settled into a sprinter's ready stance. If everything worked out the way it should, he'd have one chance to get past these wards. His eyelids fluttered open. Ghostly blue lines overlaid the shack in front of him, shimmering like a haze in the heat of summer, outlining the wards for him in the real world. Yukimaru sucked in a deep breath and then took off at a dead run. He didn't have much time. His Ryatsu control might not have been as bad as Suzuki's, but Raizhi visualization was still, technically, beyond him. Successfully overlaying vision with Ryatsu sense required a delicate balance that was all but impossible for anyone not a Kaido master to achieve. But Yukimaru had a cheat code. He didn't have to make sure his retinas stayed intact. He just had to make sure he wasn't burning through them faster than his innate regeneration could work. There were real perks to being a hollow, former hollow. The wards glowed faintly around him, concentric rings with the shack as their epicenter. He couldn't see as clearly, couldn't tell apart the different sections of wards, but he didn't need to. All he had to do was make sure he didn't touch any of it. At least whoever who'd built this had left a straight line between the entrance and the destination. Oh, but they'd buried Kaido landmines along the route, little innocuous-looking round blue discs just waiting for someone to stumble over them. He didn't need to test them to know the end result. The clearing was obviously littered with the evidence of their aftermaths. Yukimaru blinked furiously, squinting through watering eyes. Just a bit more, he was more than halfway through now, and he could see the porch of the shack had no traps. Scowling, he brought one arm up and swiped at his eyes. There was a nasty patch right up ahead, and every little bit of vision counted. Only his war-honed senses and superhuman flexibility let him lean back, all the way, as something flew over his head at a speed easily comparable to a captain's shunpo. He froze, forcing his eyes to stay open just a bit longer. Yukimaru tried to see where that had come from, his pupils darting left and right. It was an awkward position, bent almost in half backwards, but it was better than being dead. That was far too close. Whoever who'd said that had meant business, but of course, the existence of these wards already told him that. But there was nothing. He dared to blink again, scrunching up his cheeks to squeeze as much tears out as he could, because he couldn't afford any mistakes at this stage. Anyone who could lay a Kaido snare like that was automatically an S-class threat. Still nothing out of the ordinary. Cautiously, Yukimaru levered himself back upright, keeping his eyes peeled for any movement, waiting for a second shot. He must have tripped something, but he couldn't see what it was, no matter how hard he looked. What had he been doing? Running forwards, he looked down at his feet. No tripwires he could see, just the cluster of landmines that he'd been wary of earlier, but he should be too far to set any of those off. He put one foot forwards, ready to duck at any moment. Nothing happened. Speed sensors, maybe. But he was keeping well within the boundaries of the wards. He shouldn't have tripped anything at all. Wait. He had done something else, something besides running forwards. Yukimaru turned his head to the right, and then a little further, and then down, until his neck ached. Then he closed his eyes, and switched to pure Ryatsu sensing instead. The shack vanished from view, as did most of his surroundings. Shaded in blues and white, it was a lot easier to see what he'd missed earlier. He was right. There was a tripwire. It just wasn't at his feet. Well, Yukimaru said out loud, watching the tendril curl back onto itself, that part of the web pulsing an ominous purple, like the heartbeat of an enormous predator. This doesn't look good. Forwards, backwards. He had one chance to decide. A part of him said forwards, the part of him that was pure Ichigo, with the bull-headed resolve that he could run headlong into everything, and come out pristine on the other side. But Yukimaru wasn't that hollow anymore. There was a time and place for defiance, and now wasn't it? He kicked off like a rocket, no time to even spin around. Just trusted himself to be able to shunpo in a straight line even backwards, and not a moment too soon, as more tendrils of some dark energy came stabbing out at where he'd been standing, chasing after his retreat. And then the edges of the wards were clear in his Ryatsu sight, half of it now that poisonous shade of purple. But Yukimaru didn't stop to catch his breath. He had to get out of there, and call someone. Suzuki, can you get me Urahara on the line? There was a pause, like the calm before a storm, crackling with anticipation. How urgent is it? He thought for a moment. Not very, he decided, but soon would be good. Suzuki gave a disbelieving huff that transmitted surprisingly well over a mental connection. Knowing you could be standing in the middle of a trap, and as long as it wasn't about to go off right at that moment, you'd say it was not urgent. I'm going to need more details than that. That was, Yukimaru reflected ruefully, unfortunately fair. You free to drop by the mindscape for a bit. Suzuki didn't even hesitate, his voice sliding back into professionalism in the blink of an eye. Yeah, give me 10 minutes. He could feel his brother's presence fading, before it suddenly returned. You're not going to be mauled or suffer any form of injury in that period of time, are you? Yukimaru considered that caveat. No, I don't think so, he finally decided. Suzuki snorted. Somehow, that doesn't fill me with much confidence. His voice faded in and out, like he was on the move somewhere, finding a discreet location to meditate in. King could never multitask properly. On my way, Yukimaru settled himself against the trunk of an ancient oak, far enough from the scene that he was certain of his safety, and settled down to wait. It wasn't long, definitely not 10 minutes, before Suzuki's figure shimmered into view like a static Shunpo afterimage. What is it? Yukimaru got to his feet, dusting himself off habitually, even though there was no dust in their mindscape. Some habits were hard to break. It's easier to just show you. Time was a relative thing in this place, as they've long come to realize. Hours of training in here barely translated into several minutes in the real world, although it wasn't terribly useful, since muscle memory didn't quite carry over to their physical bodies. They might have been literally born of one soul, but they were still different, two sides of the same coin. Yukimaru's space, the part of the mindscape that he carved out for himself, was atop a dormant volcano. Look, he said, and called up the memories of that day to the surface of the bubbling lava. Suzuki frowned down at the sight, hand going instinctively to the Zanpakuto sheathed in his belt. They could access each other's memories, unbidden. Even, it came part and parcel of literally sharing the same space. But the mortal mind just wasn't meant to process multiple sets of memories simultaneously. Using a flat surface like a scrying pool put things into a perspective that could be processed by their puny little brains. Okay, Yukimaru might be paraphrasing that last bit. Urahara wasn't that impolite. I have a delivery tomorrow, Suzuki finally said, cutting through his thoughts. I'll drop by the second. Yukimaru cackled, successfully distracted. Oh, how's that going these days? Oh, don't remind me. Suzuki's face fell. Seriously, the other day somebody gave me a love letter, what even? He scowled as Yukimaru began cackling. He had a plan. Suzuki walked into the second, carrying a stack of boxed lunches under one arm. Lunch delivery as requested, he announced brightly, dropping the stack onto the table. Like hounds on a scent, everyone's heads snapped up, and then there was suddenly a mad rush for the food. The door to Yoruichi's office opened, and Sui Feng poked her head out, followed by Yoruichi. Come on, little bee, get yourself some lunch, Yoruichi said loudly, meeting Suzuki's eyes. There wasn't the slightest hint of surprise, even though she would be perfectly well aware that she hadn't ordered any lunch delivery whatsoever. Suzuki looked straight at her. I need to talk to Kisuke, he thought, as loudly as he could. It's about Yuki. She blinked, the only sign that she had heard him. My favorite heir, she cheered, seizing his arm and dragging him towards the table. We never see you come home anymore. What? Do you need a flyer on the job board before you'll turn up for dinner? Suzuki managed. You have to come back tonight. You've got no classes tomorrow anyway. We'll throw a huge party for you and you can sleep over tonight. So that was how she was going to play things. Sure, he said. She had better pay him for those lunches. Yoruichi certainly wasn't kidding about the party. By the time Suzuki escaped, it must have been already past midnight. He slid the door to his room open and barely stifled a squeak. Kisuke looked up from where he was sitting cross-legged beside his futon, already laid out for him. He must have arrived sometime after the servants had already come through. You wanted to talk to me. Why yeah. Wait, the privacy wards weren't up. Gods damn it. He hated nonverbal conversations. And to make matters worse, this was Kisuke. Urahara Aizen didn't notice him standing on the next building over Kisuke. Suzuki wasn't very good at Ryatsu sensing and all that nonsense in the first place, but he could get by if it was anyone other than Kisuke or Yoruichi. Even long-term familiarity wasn't helping him here. Short of groping frantically along the floor for an elusive spirit ribbon, Suzuki opted for grabbing Kisuke's hand. There had to be some Ryatsu on his skin, right? I just wanted to see your face. His mouth moved on autopilot while he thought. Yuki found something suspicious in Rukengai. Kisuke's expression softened, even as his eyes sharpened in sudden interest. Well, I'm here now. He twisted his arm, turning that awkward grab into something far more natural, thumb rubbing over his palm. It's late, and you've still got to get back to the academy tomorrow. Why don't you lie down, and I'll stay with you until you fall asleep? Well, if that was the angle he wanted to play. Suzuki shrugged off the cloak, keeping away the worst of the winter chill, crawling into the futon. In a way, this made things easier, since he didn't have to hold up his end of a conversation in the physical world while still being in multiple other conversations on a mental plane. Not if he was trying to pretend he was asleep. Yuki, he called, letting his awareness bloom across their bond. Yuki, are you there? Yeah. His brother was as grumpy as ever, even though Suzuki knew that he must have been waiting for the call ever since he left that afternoon. I'm here. Duh, right? Was there a way? I don't suppose you can piggyback on my connection to talk to Yuki directly, he asked Kisuke hopefully. It'll be faster than me having to relay everything. He flicked an eye open to see Kisuke staring at him, although his eyes were cast in shadow so Suzuki couldn't really tell what he was thinking. Not that he could tell what Kisuke was thinking even if he could see his eyes, anyway. Worth a try, the blonde finally offered cautiously. His tone was a little odd, but Yukimaru had just started complaining loudly, so Suzuki didn't pay any attention to it. If something was wrong, Kisuke would tell him. This may feel a little uncomfortable. And then a foreign Ryatsu was creeping over his skin. But it was like lying down at the beach and letting the cool waves wash over him. A little strange but hardly something he'd call discomforting. He closed his eyes, sharpening his senses, until he could see the Ryatsu all around him. This close, Kisuke's Ryatsu was more like a blanket than a ribbon, and he guided it to the almost tangible bond shimmering between him and Yukimaru, grafting it into the pocket of connection between them. Hey, Yuki, say something. Something, Yukimaru retorted instantly. So, did you get a hold of Urahara yet? He did, Kisuke affirmed. Talk to me, Yukimaru. Yukimaru was, grudgingly, impressed. There was no way even Urahara Kisuke could find his Ryatsu ribbon almost 70 districts into the Rukengai, which meant he must have somehow hijacked King's connection to him. He didn't even know that was possible. Wasn't Ryatsu unique to each person or something like that? So I was in one of the higher districts today, and there's this weird house in the middle of the woods. But who puts lethal wards over a random run-down shack unless they've got something to hide? Though he couldn't see him, Yukimaru could almost sense Urahara's thoughtful frown. It looked like the kind of Kaido net you did for the Shoten, you know. Except not really. I threw a pebble at it and nothing happened, but it seemed to be able to sense someone entering, somehow. You went and poked it, Suzuki sighed. Of course you did. Look who's talking. Yukimaru sniped back instantly. Pot, kettle, Ichigo would have done the exact same thing in his place, and, name change or not, Suzuki was very much still Ichigo at his core. I don't suppose you noticed, Urahara began, and then cut himself off. Never mind. You won't have the vocabulary to describe it anyway. It's a shame you can't transmit a photo. Yeah, that, Yukimaru was in full agreement with. You know, I was thinking back then, how nice it would have been to have a smartphone. One that could visualize Risey, even. Urahara's pause sounded purposeful. Enabler, Suzuki accused, but there was a smile in his voice this time. Yukimaru shrugged, shifting a little on his cot to get more comfortable. If it gets me the things I want. He paused, invitingly. Urahara's mental voice was amazingly non-committal. He hated the cryptic stuff. Well, Yukimaru demanded. You expect me to identify the weaknesses of a layered Kaido ward without having seen or even heard a coherent description of it? Kisuke asked. Over the sound of Suzuki laughing his head off, Yukimaru snorted. Well, can you? Urahara was silent for a long while, long enough that Yukimaru was tempted to ask if he'd fallen asleep. Describe it to me again. Yukimaru had to groan at that. Well, it's some kind of spiderweb thing. All crisscrossed, 3D netting, except for this path in the middle that's got nothing more than a few mines scattered around. And I don't suppose you know the stitch pattern, or the triggers. It had better be rhetorical. Hey, Tsuki Nai, smack him for me. Oh, silence fell again. Yukimaru rolled over, watching the snow drift in flurries outside his window. Strong Ryatsu leaves an imprint. He shook his head, and again, to make sure he was awake. What? He could almost hear the snap of a fan opening. How long are you willing to wait before going back? Urahara asked, and even though his tone was all business, Yukimaru scowled anyway. He demanded. Just tell me what's the deal with those wards and I'll be headed out right away. There was a faint sigh. Suzuki, take tomorrow morning off. I'll let your stealth instructor know you'll be absent from class. Yukimaru, can you at least wait until he gets to you? Fine, Yukimaru agreed grudgingly. But if he's going to be missing tomorrow morning anyway, why can't he come now? Because, Kisuke said dryly, even I can't magic you up a weapon out of thin air. I need to get to the lab. Kisuke sat up, his Ryatsu receding like the waves at low tide, hitting the anchor stone for the privacy seal with one foot. I need to. He cut himself off, shaking his head. Yeah, he muttered to himself. No, wait, that won't. There was no helping it when Kisuke was like that. Instead of listening to his disjointed mutterings, Suzuki crawled out of his nice and warm nest, went over to the bookshelf and flicked the hidden lever with one of the books. A section of the floor swung up like a trapdoor, tatami mat and all, revealing a set of rough-hewn stone stairs leading downwards. He yawned, stepping aside. There was no point in him going over to the lab as well, not when he'd just get in the way or fall asleep. From the sound of things, he was going to be doing a lot of running later. I'll leave you to it, then. Kisuke might or might not have heard him, judging by the quick, distracted nod he gave Suzuki as he wandered down the stairs. Another flick of the level had the trapdoor lowering back into place, and Suzuki collapsed back onto his futon. Despite his misgivings, he was well trained enough to be fast asleep in moments. There were 2 wrapped bundles sitting on the floor when he woke up. Suzuki ducked his head out of the window to check the sun's position, surprised that nobody came along to wake him up. Surely a mission like this would have been considered time-sensitive. A piece of paper fluttered to the floor when he inspected the packages closer. You look so cute that I decided to let you sleep in. Don't be late for your afternoon class, now. In place of a signature, there was a doodle of a little fan. Suzuki felt his eye twitch as he crumpled the note and shoved it into his pocket. Stupid getaboshi. But first, he was going to need breakfast. There was no way he could make it for the main meal, so Suzuki didn't even bother turning towards the main clan house, taking the side route to the kitchens instead. Servants bowed as he passed. The Shihoin were far less mired in hierarchy than clans like the Kuchiki, but it was still unheard of for one of them to be taking the servants' passageways. Well, except for Suzuki, anyway. The cook greeted him as he came in, though her hands never stopped, bustling about what looked like preparations for the midday meal. Suzuki Dono wasn't at breakfast today, she scolded, waving him towards the kitchen table. Suzuki wasn't even remotely surprised that she'd already known. The servants gossiped worse than high school girls, and that was saying something. Sit, let this one whip up something quick. There wasn't anything he could do but obey. The first time he'd offered to make himself something, she had looked like he'd killed her firstborn. Thanks, Matsuoka-san. The cook shook her head, expertly filleting 2 more fish and tossing them into the pan. She dusted her hands on her apron, ladling a generous bowl of miso soup and another bowl of freshly steamed rice. Won't be just a moment, she assured, and in the next breath whirled around to face the window. Fujiwara, I don't hear you descaling those fish. A sullen yes ma'am floated back through the open window, and the sound of a scraper started. Spoiled lot, she muttered, turning back to her filleting. Suzuki would like to say that he was bemused, but as he'd already come to learn over the past few years, this was pretty normal. Breakfast was as delicious as usual, and Suzuki pretended not to notice her refilling his rice bowl when he put it down for a moment. Back to his rooms, he wasn't stupid. He didn't drag those packages along out in the open like that. It was, and then. The main clan house, where he slept, was situated fairly centrally, but Kisuke's labs were far nearer the edges of the property. In fact, he could slip over the walls from there instead. Line made up, he tripped the anchor stone for the privacy wards again. Better to be safe than sorry, tapping in the sequence that would deactivate it in a few minutes. The trek to Kisuke's lab wasn't much of a hardship, what with the decent ceiling height and the positioning of motion sensor Kaido light balls. But Suzuki was glad to get out of the tunnels anyway. Seriously, what was with that Urahara and his love of underground illicit spaces? The only reason why Suzuki's bedroom had a direct route to the labs was because that used to be Kisuke's own bedroom, back in the day when he was growing up. Well, in the other past, and he was going to stop right here before he gave himself a headache. The lab was eerily empty, machines powered down and equipment packed away. Kisuke must be away performing his usual duties, or doing something else. Suzuki carefully hoisted the packages, making sure they didn't knock against any stray corners, and made his way to the official exit. From there, it was a short trip to the wall, and then a quick hop over and he was in Rukingai proper. The route to where Yukimaru was staying was an easy lope of a few hours, but judging by the sun's position, he didn't have as long as he'd thought. Suzuki pushed himself harder, went faster, and he estimated he had taken maybe an hour when the sign for 68 came into view. There was a Kano stronghold in the area, he remembered, and made sure to skirt around that particular can of worms. Luckily, his destination was nowhere near them, a collection of huts near the rice paddy fields, over at the forest's edge instead of the center of town. The roads were deserted. Given the hour, he wasn't surprised. The able-bodied would be tilling the fields, while the less abled would be doing whatever it was that they did to make a living, be it weaving or wood carving or whatever. He'd never seen the house with his own eyes before, but he'd gobbled up enough of Yukimaru's memories, hungry for any sight of his mother that he walked up to it with confidence, knocking on the door. The door swung open, but it wasn't Yukimaru who opened it. It was his mother. Suzuki froze. He couldn't help it. He had no inkling, no preparation. She looked much the same as she did in his memories, and for a wild, inappropriate moment he was struck by how young she really was, unhindered by the rose-tinted glasses of an adoring child. Isshin had always looked like a man in his late 40s, but she looked barely 30, if even that. Gods, he'd never thought of it that way before, but his mother had died so young. "May I help you?" Her tone was neutral, but there was the faintest hint of steel in her expression. Something that Karin and Yuzu had inherited. He could recognize it now, and was suddenly so glad that they managed to inherit some small piece of her. There was a toad stuck in his throat. He cleared it, feebly. I'm looking for Yuki." That visibly threw her for a loop. "Yukimaru," she repeated, suspicion coloring her voice. Say something intelligent, you idiot," he berated himself, but nothing came to mind. I heard, lives here." The suspicion didn't fade. In fact, it grew even stronger. "Who told you that?" "He did." Suzuki grimaced. This was not working out. She was probably going to slam the door in his face any time now. Where the world was that Yukimaru anyway? Surely he'd have come to the door by now if he was in the house. Damn it. Yukimaru hadn't wanted to wait at all last night, had he? So what if he'd already left? Suzuki squeezed his eyes shut in frustration, groping around with his mental senses, looking for that ever-present spiritual connection. If Yukimaru had already left, then he's helping old Manyama fix his roof 2 houses over that way. His eyes snapped open in surprise. His mother was still watching him, but whatever conclusions she'd drawn, it was clearly to his benefit. She glanced down at the bundles he was carrying, which, oh right, his cloak must have fallen open in his hurry. "Thank you," Suzuki said, in lieu of the myriad of other things threatening to burst from his chest. The intonation of his voice must be strange, but she made no mention of it, giving him a curt nod. "I'll walk you over." Suzuki could hear the hammering going on long before he came up to the hut proper, a steady, regular thump of metal against wood. He couldn't see Yukimaru, though, not at first glance, not until "You're late," informed a disembodied head, appearing upside down in front of Suzuki. "Yeah, well," Suzuki responded, "because that Kisuke bastard didn't wake me up with a flying kick sounded like a dumb reason even in his head." He took a large step back, looking up, until he could see that Yukimaru was just hanging upside down from the roof, his legs hooked around a rafter to keep himself from falling. Yukimaru waved an arm lazily, making circular motions in the air. "Pass me a couple of nails, will you?" His mother, their mother, made a tiny noise, but Yukimaru ignored her. "Thought you left," Suzuki told him, bending to pick up the indicated box from the ground and hand a couple over. Yukimaru muttered, swinging himself back upright. "You said you were coming." His voice floated down. "King always keeps his promises." Suzuki stared at the empty space where his head had been. He didn't want to know what his face was doing right then. "Though, since you're here and all, how about some help?" "Yeah, sure." Setting his packages on the ground, Suzuki grabbed the box with one hand and caught the edge of the roof with the other, swinging himself up easily. He could see why Yukimaru was having trouble. There was simply no place to balance the box up on the roof itself, so he'd have to hop down to retrieve more nails from the box every time he ran out. Now that he didn't have to hold the spare nails in his mouth, fixing the roof took no time at all. Yukimaru raised a hand in farewell to the old man, bending down to snag one of the packages. He examined the large square crate critically. "That one's obvious." He pointed to the obviously sword-shaped bundle. "But can this be?" Suzuki rolled his eyes. "Yes." "Awesome," Yukimaru breathed, picking up the pace. Suzuki couldn't help but trade a bemused look with their mother, following in Yukimaru's wake. By the time they got back to the hut, Yukimaru had already torn the cloth wrapping off, revealing a large square slab of stone. Running a finger around the almost invisible seam, he lifted up the lid and cooed in delight. "Awa, I knew you were my favorite brother." He sounded exactly like Yoruichi. "You only have one brother?" Suzuki retorted. Yukimaru beamed sunnily back. "Yeah, that's why you're my favorite." Their mother moved forwards to peer into the icebox and covered her mouth with a tiny gasp. "It's not much." Suzuki shrugged awkwardly. "But Yuki, well, he's always starving, and it wouldn't be fair to intrude upon you like that." She nodded, still looking a little shell-shocked, and asked, "Brother?" "Oh." Suzuki glanced at Yukimaru who, to his credit, looked a little sheepish. "Sorry." He scratched at the back of his head. Well, anyway, this is my brother, Suzuki. It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Kyoko-san." Suzuki bowed deeply. Thank you very much for taking care of Yuki these years. She bowed back, seemingly on automatic. It's no trouble at all. Yuki-kun is a lovely boy. Her eyes flitted across his form, but he didn't know what she was seeing. Shihoin. Suzuki's eyes widened, his respect for her skyrocketing. Your pendant, she said, pointing. He glanced down, and yes, there it was, the carving of a cat barely visible above the neckline of his shirt. He supposed that even in Rukengai, the 5 noble houses were well known enough that she would have known what it symbolized. Congratulations on your adoption, Shihoin Dono. That just sounded so wrong coming from her, of all people. Please, call me Suzuki, he said, and had to bite his tongue on the urge to tell her to call him Ichigo. It didn't matter that they were deep in the Rukengai. Aizen's camera flies were everywhere, and didn't Yukimaru's recent discovery prove that Aizen probably ventured as far out as this? He couldn't risk it. He wouldn't risk her. The foster of my own brother shouldn't stand on ceremony with me. Your birth brother. Suzuki couldn't blame her for being surprised. Souls usually found their way to soul society soon after their deaths, but even if they had died together, they usually didn't arrive in the same place. Finding a birth family member was just about impossible, if one even had enough Ryatsu to remember who their family members were. Most of them barely remembered their own names. It might be easier to lie, maybe, but he'd already given up so much. He wasn't giving this up. Yuki is my junior by half an hour, affirmed Suzuki. After stabilizing Ichigo's main body, Kisuke had spent around half an hour siphoning off Ichigo's Ryatsu into a second blank, so in a way it was true. Yukimaru looked up from a mouthful of yakitori and grimaced. Yeah, laugh it up, Tsuki-ni. Her eyebrows shot up. Well, they didn't really look like twins, what with their different hair and eye colors. Still, fraternal twins were very much a thing. Any family of Yuki-kuns is welcome here any day, she invited, and Suzuki couldn't help the blinding smile that spread across his face. Well, that had to have been the most awkward lunch ever. Yukimaru was so glad it was over. Suzuki spent most of it looking like someone had clubbed him over the head repeatedly. Actually, he might look less stunned if he had an actual concussion. In fact, he was staring so much that Kyoko was giving him concerned looks. Well, it wouldn't be any good to tell King to dial it down. Yukimaru doubted that he could. I need to go, Suzuki said regretfully, hands shoved in the pockets of his cloak. He looked wistful. Be careful out there, all right. You're not invincible anymore. I will, Yukimaru agreed, patting the hilt of his new katana. It looked and felt exactly like Tensa's and Jetsu, of course. Urahara was nothing if not reliable. Yeah, you do that. Suzuki bit his lip, and then pulled his hands out of his pockets. With a quick step he was in front of Yukimaru, and in the next moment there were arms around him, drawing him closer. Yukimaru stood there, so dumbfounded that he didn't even know how to respond at first. Don't tell me I need to teach you how to hug, Suzuki muttered into his ear, embarrassment blooming bright and hot in his Ryatsu. Tentatively, Yukimaru raised his own arms. Shut up, he muttered back, wrapping them around Suzuki's back. It felt nice, actually. It's not like I've done this before. He could feel the vibration of Suzuki's soundless laughter against his chest. Just means we need to do this more often, then. Yukimaru could get used to that. You really need to go, he pointed out, disentangling himself. And so do I, yeah. Suzuki scrubbed a hand over the back of his neck. Talk to you tonight. Yeah, he agreed. Might want to keep Urahara on speed dial, too. He had a feeling he was going to need it. Right, Yukimaru said aloud, staring at the deceptively serene shack, and checked Urahara's written instructions one last time. Time for round 2. The bodies from the other day had already vanished, but that was okay. It just meant he wouldn't be tripping over anything later. Yukimaru sat down on the grass in full lotus, closing his eyes. Rise he blazed to life behind his eyelids, and he concentrated a little more until they solidified into ribbons, crisscrossing and twining through each other. As Urahara had hypothesized, it was absurdly easy to pick out the deep red ones from the sea of white ribbons, to trace the path that these took. Wouldn't work on a normal Kaido ward, of course, but if they were assuming this was Aizen, then the difference in Ryatsu strengths would be so obvious that even a leftover imprint would be obvious. Yukimaru opened his eyes. Whoever who designed this trap was definitely a self-entitled asshole, because the way through the wards was directly in line with the front door. He stood up and brushed his fingers over the hilt of his katana, oddly soothed by its presence, even though it was just a piece of dead steel instead of his trusty Zanpakuto. Right? He settled into a crouch. He was, just as Ichigo had been, taught by the goddess of Flash herself. No Shunpo trap, no matter how advanced, could catch him. As his feet alighted upon the sagging porch, Yukimaru allowed himself a single satisfied smirk. There and gone again. right? He drew his sword, mentally preparing himself for any unexpected developments up and including Ambassador Seaweed busting through the doors. What? It happened once, okay. Yukimaru was still traumatized. No cartoon green men came rushing out to greet him, chibi-sized or otherwise. Yukimaru heaved a sigh of relief, though he didn't drop his guard. The shack was, at a single glance, completely empty. Yukimaru frowned. That couldn't be right. Rise, he swirled through the air, coalescing into spools of ribbons, and his gaze was drawn towards a corner of the shack, where the ribbons were stacked so deep he couldn't even see the floor. Blinking away the bright spots behind his eyelids, Yukimaru squatted down next to that innocuous piece of floor. Suzuki lived in a damn ninja house built by the Shihoin. There weren't any mechanics he hadn't seen before. Yukimaru slid the nearest door aside, exposing the wooden threshold, and then reached down and flicked the block of wood pretending to be part of the threshold aside. The wooden floorboards came away easily after that, and he thumbed at the smooth grooves. His thumb came away coated in grime. So, been a while since someone had come through this way, then. Didn't mean there weren't other entrances, just that nobody had come through this one for a while. Setting the floorboard aside carefully, Yukimaru lowered himself into the hole. There wasn't a ladder, but that didn't bother him. He blinked a few more times, until his eyesight adjusted to the darkness of the tunnel. Perk of being a former part hollow, night vision. Hey, Hukomundo was permanently cast in shadow. Being able to see in the dark was a basic life skill. He glanced down, until he could make out the floor beneath his feet, and then he let go. At least this cavern wasn't as big as Urahara's training grounds, he noted, straightening from his crouch. Maybe half the height of that, and a quarter the size. Machines of all sorts lined the walls near the entrance, each and every one of them powered down, so he couldn't tell what they did. Urahara had better turn up with that camera phone soon. Or better still, come this way himself, because Yukimaru had absolutely no idea what Aizen was doing here. Incomprehensible machines of doom gave way to rows of metal bars, but it took Yukimaru a beat to realize what he was looking at. Cells. There was a prison here, and a prison meant, "Oi, anyone in here?" His voice echoed back to him, but there was no further response. Undeterred, Yukimaru pushed forwards, checking the depths of each cell to make sure they were all empty. Maybe they couldn't respond. Maybe they didn't want to respond. A flash of silver in the corner of his eye. His gaze snapped to the end of the corridor. Somebody there, he demanded again, stepping forwards. The lights were all turned off, but Yukimaru knew better than to assume this indicated a lack of occupancy, especially since, well, this was a prison. He made his way to the end of the cell block, turning to look into the cell that had caught his attention earlier. A pair of bright blue eyes stared back at him. Yukimaru stared back, for a moment too stunned to say anything. It was a child. Aizen was keeping children in here. The icy chill of metal bars against his palm shocked him awake, and Yukimaru yanked his hand away, hissing. When had he moved? He ducked, narrowly avoiding something, and turned his head to track its trajectory. Your other side. Yukimaru dropped into a roll, and this time he saw what it was. Some kind of catapult mounted on the wall, loaded with poisonous green ammunition he had no desire to come into contact with. His hand was already on the hilt of his sword, and he drew it with no hesitation, gripping the ribbon secured to the tassel. A katana was harder to spin than a cleaver, less mass overall, but this was an exact replica of Tensa's Zangetsu, and Yukimaru had been wielding Zangetsu since he was born. At the height of its spin, he let the sword go, coaxed onto its flight path with a touch of Ryatsu. As expected, it slashed through the catapult, sending the whole structure toppling down with a horrendous crash. Those grenades bounced every which way, several of them bursting open to shower the floor in. His eyes narrowed. Acid. Yukimaru rotated his shoulders, picking his sword up before it could fall prey to an acid pool, and turning back to the child in the cell. A boy, he identified after a closer look, his face just about hidden under the mangy locks of gray hair, his clothing torn and crusted over liberally with dried blood. He was still watching Yukimaru warily, which Yukimaru definitely approved of. Any idea how to get this open? He asked conversationally, stooping down to examine the lock. The boy blinked, and then shook his head mutely. Yukimaru hummed, and then brought his sword crashing down on the lock. Nothing happened, not even another trap. Well, he muttered to himself, and then brought his Ryatsu sense to the fore again. If it had worked on everything in this hellhole so far, that explains it. It was a Kaido lock, not a physical one. No wonder brute force was useless against it. That wasn't a problem for him, though. Yukimaru wrapped a hand around the lock and pulled. Urahara had once asked him, back when he was still called Ichigo, what it was like being part Quincy and part hollow at the same time. He'd shrugged. How did someone explain what came to him naturally? It was like using Ryatsu. It just happened, without much conscious input, a click of the key in a door that had been there all along. The Kaido resisted, like a particularly stubborn piece of grease on a countertop. But Yukimaru was as much a pureblood Quincy as Ichigo had been. Or, perhaps, since he had no Shinigami heritage to dilute his gifts in the first place. Breaking down an organic Risey in the surroundings was a basic Quincy maneuver, and everything in Soul Society, but especially Kaido, was entirely made of Risey. With a crackle, the lock dissolved in his fist. The kid stepped out cautiously, arms braced for a sudden attack. Yukimaru liked him already. Silently, he pointed at the cell behind Yukimaru. Yukimaru turned around and let loose a startled curse at the sight of a small ginger-haired girl child lying on the floor, unmoving. The second Kaido lock came away easier. Or maybe it was just that Yukimaru wasn't paying attention to it this time. His focus on the unconscious girl, on the way the boy was clutching at the bars, seemingly unaware of the way his fingers were frosting over. Yukimaru backed away once the cell door was open, letting the boy go to his friend, sister, foster sister, he decided. That was the most likely option in Rukengai. Got a name, kid? Shiro, said the boy, carefully hefting the girl into his arms. Yukimaru knew better than to offer to help. And this is Hana. I'm Yuki, he responded, turning away once he could see that Shiro had the girl secured. Come on, exits this way. The sooner he got out of there, the sooner he could call for cleanup. Shiro grunted, and then again, and it didn't sound like a noise of ascent the second time. Yukimaru glanced back, just in time to see him delivering a vicious kick to one of the machines. The machine sputtered, belching something just a tad too viscous to be just smoke, and Yukimaru was moving before he knew it. Run! Shiro backed away a step, and then another, almost tripping over his own feet. Yukimaru cursed, running back towards him, holding his arms out. Shiro hesitated just a brief moment, and then decisively shoved Hana into Yukimaru's arms, bolting for the exit. Yukimaru followed closely behind, not looking back at the cloud of poison spreading through the cavern. He didn't have that kind of time to spare. The exit was really high up. Yukimaru craned his neck. How was anyone supposed to make that kind of jump with no running start possible? Aizen probably had a ladder stashed away somewhere, but they were out of time. Already Yukimaru could feel his eyes stinging, his Ryatsu flaring wildly to combat the worst of the toxins. They had to get out of there. Now, this way, Shiro shouted amidst a bout of coughing, diving down a side tunnel like a fox into a hole. Yukimaru dove into the tunnel after him, gagging. His lungs were burning with every breath, like he couldn't draw enough air into them. What in the 18 levels of hell was in that poison? He didn't know anything could work so fast. His foot met air, and then he was going down, they were going down, and Yukimaru barely had the presence of mind to tuck his body over the little girl child, letting their momentum carry them down the slope. He barely registered that they'd stopped, that he was lying in something wet and cold. Fucking hell, he grunted and passed out. Yukimaru awoke with an abrupt start, going from laying down to sitting bolt upright with no memory of anything in between. Muscles tensing and heart racing. Oh, you're awake. His hands were shaking. Yukimaru gritted his teeth, forcing his fingers to unclench one by one. He looked up, and a canopy met his eyes, the aged wood thrown into sharp relief by the fire crackling away in a pit of pebbles. Shiro was crouched by the fire, feeding it a few more sticks. The girl was lying on a ratty old blanket next to him, asleep or still unconscious he couldn't tell. Outside the window, everything was covered in a blanket of white snow. Where am I? Our house, Shiro responded, poking at the fire. Well, that part was obvious. Which district? Shiro looked up, blinking at him, and then looked back at the fire. What's a district? Yukimaru heaved a huge sigh, getting off the pallet. Well, it wasn't as if he was lost. All he had to do was feel for Tsuzuki, and then follow their connection home. His stomach gave a loud rumble. Well, okay, maybe he could get some food first. Any lakes nearby? For fish, he clarified, seeing the confusion on Shiro's face. It's frozen over, though, cautioned Shiro. Yukimaru snorted. Yeah, what else did he expect from a lake in the dead of winter? Not a problem. Shiro got up and went to the door, throwing one last look at the girl as he led the way out. It's this way. The lake wasn't too far from the hut, although Yukimaru might have a little trouble finding the way back himself, on a winter night as dark as this one. Leaving Shiro standing by the lakeside, Yukimaru strode to the center of the lake. His Ryatsu flexed and unwound, a chaotic cloud of black flames brewing over the frozen waters. He breathed in, clenched a fist, and struck. The ice shattered beneath his fist with the dull roar of a flash fire, water spewing out of the breach like a fire hydrant, flinging fish everywhere. Yukimaru snatched a few out of mid-air and tossed them over to Shiro, who almost fumbled the catch. His eyes were wide open for once, glittering blue in the moonlight. "Hope you like fish," Yukimaru told him unnecessarily, using the front of his hakama like a cradle to hold the rest of his catch, the way he'd seen some of the farmers do. Hana was still asleep, or really unconscious when they got back. Yukimaru was leaning towards unconscious, because she didn't even twitch as he started descaling the fish, filling the little hut with the stink of fish scales. Shiro didn't complain either, although he scrunched his nose up a little, sharpening several sticks of firewood to be used as skewers. Yukimaru looked down at the mountain of fish in front of him, and then shrugged, tossing a few more in front of Shiro. For her, when she wakes up, he could always catch more fish whenever he wanted any, but Shiro probably couldn't do the same, based on what he could sense. The girl was clearly the Ryatsu powerhouse of the duo, and probably why Aizen wanted them in the first place. "Speaking of which, how long were you in there?" he asked conversationally as the fish crackled over the flames. Shiro tilted his head to the side, gaze unblinking. It would look eerie, maybe, except Yukimaru had seen so much more bizarre things in his life for some kid to even blip on his radar. About 2 seasons. That would explain it, then. If the lab was abandoned for a couple of weeks or even months, the girl was likely dying from the lack of food. Make her fish soup when she wakes up. Easier to swallow. He didn't know why he was bothering with the advice, except maybe they reminded him a little of Ichigo and Yuzu. Yukimaru shook his head sharply, trying to dislodge those memories. King didn't like to think of his sisters often, nowadays. He patted his belly, getting up. He had to get going himself. There was someone waiting for him, too. As he pushed the door of the hut open, he heard from behind him. "Thank you, Yuki-san." "Kusajishi," you said. Near the former stronghold of Tsunanika, the Denrei Shinki crackled. Kisuke poked at it, making a mental note to get a start on upgrading the communication system soon. Couldn't have them having signal issues, no matter where the user was. "Yeah," Suzuki agreed. Or maybe he should just overhaul the whole system, start anew. Yukimaru did want proper smartphones after all. Kisuke paced through the clearing another time. "Well, there's nothing here," he finally said. There could have been, maybe, but someone had come along before him, and had scrubbed all traces of Ryatsu from the area. He hung up, tipping his bucket hat back so that he could see the afternoon sun. "This is shaping up to be a bigger problem than we'd thought." Suzuki-san wasn't in class yesterday morning. His chopsticks didn't even freeze on their way to his mouth. "Family matters," Suzuki mumbled through a mouthful of rice. It wasn't even a lie. He'd beat up anyone who dared to claim Yukimaru wasn't family. Well, he'd cheerfully beat up Yukimaru too. But that was kind of how his family functioned. From Kisuke to Yoruichi to Goatface to Yukimaru himself, and he wouldn't have it any other way. Hidaki just nodded and went back to his own breakfast. But Akira wasn't as easily dissuaded. "Is it?" He lowered his voice to barely more a whisper. "Onni stuff." "Oh, right. Didn't Akira want to join the Onmitsukido after graduation?" Suzuki lifted his shoulder in a sort of shrug. It could count as a simple Onmitsukido mission, he supposed. He was making contact and performing a covert delivery of supplies. The moment he could clear his schedule, Kisuke would be dropping by the area to investigate. "I'm immune to most poisons," he had pointed out when Suzuki argued that he should wait for backup. And it would only be a scouting mission. But it wasn't his words, it was the tiny quirk of Kisuke's lips that finally convinced Suzuki Kisuke really wasn't intending to take any risks. And unlike Yukimaru, Kisuke could generally be trusted not to do stupid, rash things. Generally, the cafeteria was emptying at a rate that suggested class was about to start soon. Suzuki downed the last dregs of his miso soup, picked up his tray, and joined the queue to the return station at a far more leisurely pace than the rest of the students. It wasn't like their first class today would be particularly difficult for him. It was on Jinzen. Jinzen, the method by which a Shinigami accessed their mindscape to speak with their Zanpakuto. The same technique Suzuki used at least 5 times just yesterday alone. No, he doubted he'd have any problems performing Jinzen. Onabora droned on, explaining the procedure to the class, but Suzuki tuned him out. The meditation chamber looked almost like a shrine. Little pots of joss sticks planted around the edges of the hall, and the scent of incense heavy in the air. The incense wasn't overpowering, though, the way human incense tended to be, it was just there. He slipped out of Seiza, crossing his legs instead. He hadn't needed the lotus position to achieve Jinzen for at least 6 years now, but it was what everyone else was doing. And this was the one core class he couldn't be exempted from. The floor went from brown tatami to smooth obsidian in the space between one breath and the next. "Yuki," he called, getting up from the ground. There wasn't any response at first, not that he was expecting an immediate reply. It was early morning, which meant Yukimaru was either busy or possibly still sleeping. He did have a lot of poison to purge from his system. What? Busy and not resting like he should be. Suzuki shook his head. He wasn't remotely surprised by that fact. Yukimaru materialized out of thin air, his body a shimmering incorporeal form that indicated he wasn't in full Jinzen. That part of his consciousness was still back in the real world. Suzuki scowled. The show off. He knew Suzuki still couldn't do this, so wasn't this just rubbing it in his face? His brother looked like he was sitting at some kind of desk, with a piece of wood in his hand and a tiny carving knife in the other. Things that he was actively interacting with in the real world, no doubt. So free today. Suki-nai, he complained, brandishing his knife in a manner that would have been vaguely threatening if it wasn't for the fact that there was no accompanying killing intent. It's Jinzen class. Yukimaru shook his head in bemusement. Well, I suppose you've accomplished your objective then. He frowned down at the piece of wood and then shaved off a tiny sliver. The result didn't look any different to Suzuki. But then, he wasn't the one who did this for a living. You're hardly my Zanpakuto spirit these days. Suzuki felt the need to point out. That was what finally prompted Yukimaru to look up from his work, eyebrows arched. Do I need to remind you that I can still kick your ass, King? Suzuki took a step back, carefully staying out of lunging range. Well, if Yukimaru was capable of making violent overtures like that, he was probably recovering well, and there was no cause for concern. I think class is almost over, he remarked hurriedly, when Yukimaru's eyes narrowed further and his body started solidifying in the mindscape, a sure sign that Yukimaru was no longer splitting his attention between the real world and their mindscape. There was no way he was going to fight someone who was still recovering. Besides, he didn't have a protective barrier up, so he'd knock his entire class unconscious with the Ryatsu output. Suzuki opened his eyes in the real world, stretching out his limbs idly and grinning a little at the litany of curses he could hear in his mindscape. It went well for Suzuki-san, then, asked Akira, starting on his own stretches. Before he could figure out what to say, Hidaki already answered. Suzuki-san's probably already met his Zanpakuto spirit. He pointed out, flicking a quick look at Suzuki's face. That's generally what a great noble clan does before sending the heir to the academy. Akira bounced on the balls of his feet, bent over double with his knees straight, and then promptly fell into a forward roll that ended with a perfect split. Show off, Hidaki coughed. You just wish you could do it, retorted Akira. They were some of the last people still lingering in the meditation chamber, stretching their muscles out after an hour of immobility. Most of the class had left as soon as they could, the idiots. They'd be feeling it later on. I heard we'll be starting with Asachi soon, Hidaki remarked, changing the subject. Really? Suzuki was honestly startled at that. He could have sworn Kisuke and Yoruichi had made it sound like Asachi were usually only handed out much later. Then again, who knew how long Kisuke had spent digging those holes? Come to think of it, did he want to know why Kisuke spent most of his academy career digging holes in the ground? Suzuki shook his head, refocusing on the conversation between Hidaki and Akira. Where did you hear that from? The fires of the blacksmith's forge are lit, according to my aunt, Hidaki responded easily. Suzuki was just glad he didn't question why Suzuki didn't already know that, given that he was supposed to be the heir to the Onmatsukido. He did get a lot of secret information, just not this kind. Hopefully an Asachi will help me connect to my mindscape better, Akira bemoaned, rubbing his eyes. All I've been seeing is pitch black. He grinned, snapping his fingers. Unless that's my mindscape. Man, I hope not. Not being able to see anything would seriously suck. How am I supposed to fight if I can't see? Someone abruptly pushed past them. Akira murmured, scratching the back of his head sheepishly as he watched the classmate he had unknowingly insulted walk off. And so, I don't need your pity, the other person snarled, quickening his steps down the corridor. Suzuki opened his mouth and then closed it again. Truth be told, he didn't even know Tozen was in their year, given how little the first class interacted with the rest of the batch, and the fact that Suzuki only shared about 2 classes with the rest of the first class. If it wasn't for the fact that Suzuki occasionally passed him by while running his errand routes, he wouldn't even have known Tozen was an academy student right now. But there was no mistaking his bright blue academy uniform. Those few times Suzuki saw him in the streets, he was usually accompanied by a woman wearing the uniform of an unseated officer, and not Kamamura as Suzuki would have expected. Maybe Tozen had another friend. It wasn't like Suzuki knew him very well, since Tozen had been an enemy for as long as he'd known him. There was no use thinking about it right now. Suzuki followed Hidaki and Akira to the cafeteria. Tozen wasn't in class that afternoon. Do you think he's still offended? Akira hissed into Suzuki's ear. He was Suzuki's designated partner for the day, a fact Suzuki politely pretended not to notice, but was secretly glad for. Hideki and Akira had colluded, for some reason, to make sure most of the academy students didn't bother him, although they couldn't keep away the truly shameless or determined. Paradoxically, those were the ones Suzuki were happy to handle, either with a deadpan stare or a fist to the face, depending on their business with him. For this class, Hideki was paired with some girl called Himura. Suzuki didn't know much about her, but if somebody as picky as Hideki was willing to work with her, she must be decent at it. Maybe she was from another minor noble family. Akira came staggering back to their shared table, a large glass jar balanced precariously in his hands. There was nary a flutter of black wings as he set the jar down slowly on the tabletop, a positive sign that he had not disturbed the pair of Jigokucho nestled within. Unscrewing the cap of the jar open gently, Suzuki reached and cupped his hands around one of the butterflies. The paper-thin wings beat against his palm in agitation, before stilling as he sent soothing waves of Ryatsu over it in slow pulses. Maintaining his tempo, Suzuki cautiously lifted it out of the jar, giving a nod for Akira to proceed to do the same with the other. Jigokucho couldn't breed on their own. Nobody knew why, although Kisuke obviously had his own theories, but the fact of the matter was that academy students every year were used to breed Jigokucho, both as a Ryatsu control exercise and a way to replenish the hell butterfly population. Replenish, increase. Could Jigokucho die? If he remembered correctly, sometimes they got eaten. Suzuki shook himself out of that train of thought. Now came the delicate part, the part Onibora said most of the class would fail at. Call him competitive, but he didn't want to be one of them. Now that both Jigokucho were out of the jar, Suzuki stared unblinkingly at Akira, slowing down his breathing to match the speed they'd agreed on before starting. It was also agreed that Suzuki would initiate, because he'd had more experience manipulating his Ryatsu, even if most of those ended in failure. Half closing his eyes to better concentrate, Suzuki narrowed his focus. It was easier than he thought it would be. The classroom was perfectly silent, everyone concentrating on their own tasks, and there was no Ganju or Ishida making snide remarks in his ear. He extended a tendril of Ryatsu in Akira's direction, winding it around his cupped palms. Akira couldn't sense spirit ribbons properly yet, and so this was the compromise Onibora had advised everyone to use. Like tuning a radio to find a station, there was a burst of what could be described as static before Suzuki was suddenly hyper-aware of Akira's Ryatsu. Ready. He projected the thought along their temporary connection. There was the mental equivalent of a determined nod, and together they synchronized their pulses of Ryatsu. Breathing evenly, the duo slowly brought their cupped hands into contact with each other and unfurled their fingers as one. The two butterflies fluttered, their wings brushing against each other's. Suzuki sent out another pulse of Ryatsu, feeling Akira do the same across him. Onibora said there should be a sudden drain. He didn't feel any drain on his Ryatsu, but his butterfly suddenly glowed red-tinged black, while Akira's glowed blue as expected. The Jigokucho on his palm fluttered its wings, once as though satisfied. Now for the last step. Suzuki forced his hands to stay steady, his arms as relaxed as he could make them, as Akira tilted his palm just enough for his butterfly to transfer onto Suzuki's. Heart pounding, Suzuki tipped his palms towards the jar until the pair of Jigokucho settled back inside. He couldn't help but try to peer into the jar when Akira was screwing the lid back on, but the outside was painted an inkai black, and he couldn't see anything. Only then did they both slump backwards, completely drained, so it looked like the Jigokucho fed on their Ryatsu. Suzuki eyed the closed jar contemplatively. Would hollow Ryatsu turn them into mutant butterflies, then? No wonder these things need two people, Akira complained, shaking his hand out. I feel like it took out a whole chunk of my Ryatsu. Suzuki stared down at his own hand and opted not to mention the fact that he hadn't noticed a difference. Today's messaging route was slightly different, Suzuki noted. Apparently Kyoraku wanted to arrange a meeting with his old mentor, but the topic wasn't not urgent enough to warrant the use of a hell butterfly or an inner court troops messenger. To be honest, he didn't even know anymore. One of the notes last week did sound pretty urgent. The quickest route to the 1st Division involved cutting through the 2nd Division's backyard, over another wall, and then along the footpath that ran parallel to the central 46 chambers. It wasn't a route most messengers would use, since the sprawling backyard of the 2nd housed the training grounds for the Onmitsukido. Suzuki ducked a flurry of bow shuriken, dodging through a series of spike traps, and raised a hand in salute to the training instructor guiding a squad of new recruits through the area. He was keeping to the edges of the training grounds, where the traps were of a low enough level that a moderate shunpo speed could deal with the majority of them. Shortcuts were meant to be faster than the circuitous route, after all. Another application of Ho-Ho saw him safely flip over the high wall, above the barbed wire running across the top, and then he was through, jogging along the footpath that separated the 2nd Division compound and the Central 46 compound. From this angle, he could just barely see the tops of the Sagitakyoran towers, the residential enclave hidden almost completely from prying eyes. He wondered if they were the same 46 people whom Aizen killed in the future. Will kill in the future, had killed in another future. Time travel was so confusing. So lost in his own thoughts, it took Suzuki a few moments to realize the noise he was hearing wasn't just inside his own head. Open up, please. Someone was banging at the gates in front of the Central 46 compound. I need to speak to someone. Suzuki gives the note in his hand another glance. Well, Kyoraku did say this missive wasn't that urgent. Tucking the note into his pocket, he turns decisively down the side path that would lead to the Central 46 compound instead of the 1st Division. The voice cuts off, replaced with the sound of a scuffle. Suzuki sped up a little, hearing the sounds of whoever it was pleading with the guards to just let him speak to someone. That even a few minutes of audience would be sufficient. Enough. There was the sound of feet scuffing against the ground like someone was getting shoved, and a yelp of pain. Know your place, Rukengai trash. Suzuki rounded the corner at a something approximating his true speed, and even then he barely managed to catch the teenager before he could hit the ground. Are you alright? He asked, before realizing just who it was. Tozen stared up at him, eyes wide with confusion and shock. Who are you? The guard demanded. There were another 5 guards behind him, and at his signal all of them leveled their spears at him. Suzuki blinked. Well, they weren't a threat, but there was an easier way to get an audience with Central 46 than leaving all the guards groaning on the floor. Knowing his luck, if he did that, even if he got Tozen all the way into the chamber, they were going to refuse to speak to him on principle. Shihoin Suzuki, he announced. The guards hesitated, the tips of their spears wavering. Suzuki quashed the instinct to take advantage of their weakness. Well, he asked, actually somewhat curious as to the reply. Will Central 46 grant me an audience? Back in his era, the Central 46 hadn't granted audience to even the Siteicho, but that was because they were already all dead. He wondered if it would make a difference if they were alive. The guards glanced awkwardly at each other. We'll go and inform them, one of them eventually mumbled, all but fleeing. Well, that was a pleasant surprise. At least it wasn't an outright no. Suzuki folded his arms, making himself comfortable while they waited, and then thought to ask, so, why did you want an audience with Central 46 anyway? One of the guards twitched violently. Suzuki ignored him. Tozen gaped at him. If Shihoin Dono didn't know. Suzuki, he corrected absently. Too many Shihoins around, I never know who people are talking to. If, Tozen swallowed, and then continued, if Suzuki Dono didn't know, then why did you help me? You haven't been coming to class for the past few days, Suzuki pointed out. Akira keeps trying to apologize, and he says he can't find you at all. Whatever it is, it's important enough for you to skip class. Tozen looked down at the ground. My friend, she's an unseated Shinigami in the 12th Division, passed away 3 days ago. Oh, Suzuki uncrossed his arms, at a loss of what to do. I'm sorry to hear that. He let that hang in the air for another moment, but he just had to know. But what does that have to do with Central 46? Because her husband murdered her. Tozen burst out, fists clenched and eyes blazing. He said as much to my face when I confronted him, said she should have known better than to talk back to him, that she should have remembered her place. What a bastard. Suzuki spat with feeling. So you're here to testify at his trial. From what he remembered, the Central 46 held hearings and handed down punishments. There is no trial, Tozen bit out. The 9th Division can't charge lower noble house members unless their actions can be seen as treasonous to Soul Society. Only the Central 46 has the authority to do that. Suzuki nodded, making a face. Maybe that law made sense during the initial founding of the Godai 2 millennia ago, back when the sole focus of the Godai was on repelling hollow incursions into Soul Society. But now, things needed to change. He looked up, checking the position of the sun. It looked like even his name could only get them so far. Central 46 was clearly taking its own sweet time in delivering a reply, which probably meant that they were going to be let in. But they wanted them to sweat out here for a while. He was technically on duty though. Kyoraku might be pretty easygoing, but there had to be a limit as to how much of a delay he'd accept. Surely, they did request for junior seated officer level shunpo after all. If Suzuki Dono is busy, this is enough. Unexpectedly, Tozen offered. Suzuki slanted him a look. You sure? It was entirely possible that Central 46 could refuse to grant him an audience if Tsuzuki wasn't hanging around to bully them into it. Tozen bowed, going far lower than was conventional. Yes, thank you. I have not had any luck until Tsuzuki Dono came along. But now I have my opportunity. Tsuzuki Dono is working, is he not? Suzuki took his hand out of his pocket, where he'd been unconsciously crinkling the note from Kyoraku. If you're sure, then. He could feel Tozen's eyes on his back until he turned out of sight. Ran into Tozen today. Suzuki grunted, blocking Yukimaru's downward swing. Yukimaru made a vaguely inquisitive noise. Isn't he, like, in your class? He scrunched up his nose, sidestepping Suzuki's attempt to catch him off guard with a Jujiki Byakurai to the knee. How's that a surprise? Suzuki blasted him away with a tenrin, explaining the situation. Now I kind of feel bad for him, he sighed, rubbing at the bridge of his nose. If Aizen helped him sort out the murder, I can see why he ended up following Aizen. Yukimaru snarled wordlessly, raised his Zanpakuto above his head, and began twirling it rapidly. If you've got the time to think about other people, you can do your own history research. Face paling rapidly, Suzuki brought his own Zanpakuto up just in time to block a vicious aerial strike. The bandages wrapped around the handle of Yukimaru's Zanpakuto, allowing his owner to retrieve him like a gigantic boomerang. Caught off guard, Suzuki almost fell victim to a brutal kick aimed to possibly separate his head from his shoulders, as Yukimaru flitted forwards with a shunpo so fast his afterimage did not fade until after Suzuki had, barely, jerked out of the way at the last minute. The kick instead connected with his shoulder, throwing him backwards violently. Skidding along the ground, Suzuki settled into his most solid defensive stance. Yukimaru did not disappoint, dashing forwards to press the advantage with wildly unpredictable swings mixed with abrupt bodily attacks wherever he sensed an opening. Their blades locked, each seeking to overpower each other. True to his unpredictable nature, Yukimaru shifted his weight to the ball of his right foot and applied a sharp burst of Ryatsu against the ground, using his sudden added momentum to pressure Suzuki's blade while his left leg came up, seeking to ram harshly into Suzuki's groin area. Not to be outdone, Suzuki had jumped up the moment he sensed Yukimaru's Ryatsu flare, briefly transferring his entire body weight to the Zanpakuto still connected to Yukimaru's before tucking his legs in and using his own momentum to roll into a backflip in mid-air above Yukimaru's head. Yukimaru recovered in an instant and was already on Suzuki by the time he turned around, jabbing with pointy elbows as much as he did his Zanpakuto. Suzuki jerked one leg up, and then the other as Yukimaru's foot slid into the space where they had been previously. Leaping backwards, he barely avoided a sweeping kick with an inspired star jump, crashing his Zanpakuto against Yukimaru's and using the force to propel himself backwards. Yukimaru did not follow. For a moment both gasped for breath, and then by some unspoken signal lowered their Zanpakuto at the same time. Your attacks are amazing, complimented Suzuki. You kept me on my toes the entire time. Yukimaru laughed, a real laugh this time. Says the guy who can keep up with me. Just about anyone else would have been down right now, and yet you managed to evade every single one. It really inspires me to come up with new attacks. Grinning broadly, Suzuki walked closer. In retrospect, he should have known what would happen. The moment he came within range, Yukimaru kicked him abruptly in the shin, hard. Suzuki yowled in pain, hopping up and down on one foot, and reflected ruefully that perhaps he did deserve that for dumping all his history research projects on Yukimaru. We will be going on a field trip today, Onabora announced, before they had scarcely settled into seize a position in the meditation chamber. There was a ripple of excitement through the class, as the students who had an idea what was coming shared their thoughts with those who didn't. Next to Suzuki, Akira was practically bouncing in his seat. Asachi, we finally get our own Asachi. Hidaki made a mow of distaste, which Suzuki ignored with ease. Hidaki's academies and jutsu stances were passable, but compared to his Kaido skills they weren't even worth a passing mention. He wouldn't be surprised if Hidaki was one of those Shinigami who never awakened his Zanpakuto spirit. He knew plenty of kick-ass Shinigami who didn't have Zanpakuto spirits, like Hachigen and Tessai. Even those who did, like Yoruichi, might not use them. Onabora generously waited for the hubbub to settle before explaining the details of this field trip. Do not dally, he warned. Anyone who does not arrive at the blacksmiths with the rest of the class will not be receiving an Asachi this year. Unsurprisingly, none of them strayed from the path, even though the route Onabora took them on wound through several streets of vendors hawking their goods, from pretty hairpins to handicrafts to all manners of street food. The doors shut behind all of them, and Suzuki could feel a ward flaring into existence over the door. It looked like the Godai took the security of these Asachi seriously. Well, he supposed he didn't want to see bands of mercenaries wielding Zanpakuto either. Generally, the higher your level of Ryatsu, the higher the chance of awakening your Zanpakuto spirit, lectured Onabora, pacing across the workshop. But Ryatsu level is not the only factor. Mental strength, your attitude, your beliefs and values. All of these determine how likely your Zanpakuto will respond to you. Some of you will find it easier than others, especially those who have been diligently meditating every day and have already found your mindscape. A few students glanced at each other in alarm. In preparation for your first human world patrol in 2 months, all of you will begin meditating with Asachi. He indicated the row of gleaming blades hanging on the wall behind him. Made by Nimiya Otsu himself, Asachi have been used by academy students for generations, and are the best tool to help students awaken their own Zanpakuto spirits. Sensei, a girl spoke up, how would we know if we have found our Zanpakuto spirits? Onabora smiled. When the time comes, you will know what to do. At a gesture, the class collected one Asachi each and filed into the back room. Some of the other students made faces of distaste at how the floor was graying with accumulated soot and age, but Suzuki figured it couldn't be helped when they were in a blacksmith's workshop. He dropped into the lotus position, laid the unsheathed Asachi on his lap, and turned his focus inwards. Yukimaru's attention flashed like a wisp of quicksilver, there and gone again when he realized Suzuki wasn't there for him. Opening his eyes, he was greeted with the sight of shadowed skies. Suzuki got to his feet, clasped his hands and waited calmly. A whisper of movement behind him. So it is time. He inclined his head without turning around. Will you come? Call for me. Suzuki could feel his fingers twitch slightly back in the real world, almost as though he was a bystander watching someone else was controlling his body. This wasn't Tensa Zangetsu. It would never be Tensa Zangetsu. But this new Zanpakuto spirit was as much a part of his soul as Tensa had been. And Tensa himself didn't mind the fact that he was no longer just a Zanpakuto spirit. Call my name. Zangetsu hadn't been enough to take down Aizen. He needed. Suzuki brought his right hand up, sliding the tips of his fingers over the Asachi in his lap. Wherever they came into contact with the sword, his fingers burned, like he was touching fire instead of cool metal. Following some unknown instinct, he channeled his Ryatsu through his fingertips into the blade, until there was a sudden absence of feeling, like he was in a plane and his ears had just popped from the pressure. And I shall answer, and the Asachi under his fingers was suddenly alive. He couldn't explain it, but it was like an extension of his Ryatsu had somehow taken up residence in the sword. It was a completely different feeling from Zangetsu, but then again, Zangetsu's material form had been formed entirely from his Ryatsu, whereas this was a spirit residing in an Asachi. Solemnly, Suzuki bowed over the blade. Arigato gozaimasu. The toll of the bell made everyone jump, and a couple of people even fell over. Suzuki relaxed the death grip on his Zanpakuto, sliding it back into its sheath before anyone could take note of the fact that he'd almost raised it in preparation for a non-existent fight. Must be all that thinking about Aizen. He wasn't usually this jumpy. Onabora clapped his hands for their attention. Now that all of you have received your Asachi, you are expected to meditate with it regularly outside of class. Your first holo patrol will be coming up in 2 months' time. At that time, your mastery over your Asachi may mean the difference between life or death. The class was silent. For once everyone was paying full attention. Class dismissed. You may spend the lunch break outside the academy, so long as you return in time for afternoon class. In the stampede that ensued, Suzuki ended up leaning against a wall, waiting for everyone else to leave first. That's a Zanpakuto, isn't it? He looked up as Hidaki and Akira joined him against the wall. Tentatively, he nodded. Hidaki nodded back in satisfaction. Good, that would really help when we start holo patrols. He flexed his fingers, looking down. The mortality rate for those have really been rising these few years. Wait, mortality rate. Suzuki had been under the impression that they were going to be starting with training exercises, maybe with a few large holodummies rigged to appear at strategic locations. Akira sobered, looking over at Hidaki. I didn't know that, but I won't be surprised. Couple other people in the class have been talking about that too. Himura said she asked around, and the second-year first class lost like 10 students last year. Given that one class had around 40 students, that was roughly a quarter of the class. Looked like he was going to train his Shikai techniques, just in case. Speaking of training, an image of Yoruichi cracking a whip and grinning maniacally made a chill go down his spine. Suzuki wondered if there was any way he could hide the news of his new Zanpakuto from her. Shihoin dono. Suzuki blinked the image away, looking up to see Tozen standing in front of him. I told you, call me. Tozen dropped to his knees, pressing his forehead against the floorboards, and Suzuki went silent. Please, Shihoin Dono, I beg of you, hear my plea and seek justice for my friend, for there is none to be found elsewhere. Suzuki blinked, very slowly. To say that he was surprised was an understatement. You brought your case before Central 46, he asked, just to confirm, although he didn't think Tozen was the type to leave just because the guards were snubbing him. I did. Tozen's forehead was pressed to the floor in supplication, his voice wretched with anguish. Scarcely had I finished my recount when they told me not to waste their time with baseless accusations born of petty jealousy against my betters. His voice shook so hard that Suzuki could barely understand the words, and had me evicted from the premises. He angrily swiped at the tears streaming down his face, lifting his head to look imploringly at Suzuki. Please, Shihoin Dono, you must believe me. I really did hear her husband admit to murdering her. I believe you, Suzuki interrupted. He wasn't surprised, and he could definitely see why Tozen had given everything up for Aizen. With his illusions and overall ability, it wouldn't have been difficult for Aizen to mete out the required justice in exchange for Tozen's undying loyalty. Suzuki had neither the interest in nor the capacity to make long-term plans like that, but he agreed with Tozen. This injustice could not be left to stand. What? Apparently Tozen hadn't actually believed Suzuki would listen to him. Suzuki sighed. It said a lot about nobles in Soul Society, didn't it? Well, if Yoruichi didn't want him to do anything about it, she shouldn't have put him in this position. You're not the kind of person who would make up something like this, he explained to a shell-shocked Tozen. And moreover, your hearing is sharper than the average person's. You may have heard something he didn't intend anyone to overhear. Somebody like this, somebody who had the power to, but refused to protect the person who should have been the most precious to him. He hated someone like that. Tell me his name. Tozen hesitated just a moment more and then. Hojo Takatoki. From where he was leaning against the wall and largely pretending he didn't exist, Hidaki suddenly went into a violent coughing fit. Tozen looked over, looking offended. Someone you've heard of? Suzuki asked rhetorically, before Tozen could say anything. That was not the reaction of someone completely clueless. Not him specifically, Hidaki was quick to clarify, looking a little sheepish. Just the Hojo family. He glanced around, as though concerned about eavesdroppers, and then lowered his voice. And Hojo Takamasa, you know. It took him a moment, but Suzuki was surprised to realize that in fact, he did know. Isn't he the one who? Obligingly, Suzuki lowered his voice into a barely audible hiss. The one who killed all his daughter's children when they grew old enough to take over, so that he can continue ruling as regent. Hidaki gave him a confused look, and belatedly Suzuki realized that what he was recounting was human world history. He tipped his chin up, kind of embarrassed at his slip but unwilling to show it. Judging from Hidaki's reaction earlier, he couldn't have been too far off the mark anyway. Hidaki was far too well trained to be surprised by much. Hidaki pursed his lips, but he didn't say anything to contradict Suzuki's words. Hojo Takamasa is a member of Central 46, he commented instead. That would explain why they will not hear Tozen-san's plea. Tozen slammed a fist into the floorboards, his face twisted in fury. Hidaki jumped again, and the door leading to the outer forge clattered open. Hey, one of the blacksmiths shouted. Why are you brats still in here? Sorry. They bowed in apology, scuttering away from the shop. It led to the question of where they could go next. Being lunchtime, anywhere with a seating area was full, and they could hardly talk about something like this on the open street. In the end, they bought their lunches from roadside stalls and took them to a less populated corner of the academy. Suzuki-san, what are you going to do? Well, I'll pay them a visit. It would always be better if he could hear the confession in person as well. A pity there were no recording devices in Soul Society. No. Suzuki leaned back slightly at the sheer vehemence in the three identical responses. Why? He asked in genuine bafflement. You can't just walk into a place like that. Hidaki hissed in agitation. There are guards everywhere, Tozen agreed. People don't leave places like that alive, unless they let you, Akira rounded off. Suzuki stared at the three of them, bewildered. The Hojo clan was relatively small, given the propensities of the clan head. So, there's, 40 people in the compound. The Fujiwara clan was 200 strong, with another 100 or so dedicated guards. We took it with 3 people, and I didn't even have a Zanpakuto at that time. Okay, that might have been a bit of a stretch, given that Yoruichi had arrived with 5 squads before they had to put it to the test whether they could actually take down an entire compound with just the 3 of them. But Suzuki had faith in their capabilities, even with Kisuke's concussion. Unless one of them has Bankai or something. He kind of doubted it. There were no captains nor lieutenants named Hojos in the Godai history books he had to read, so the most any of them should have is Shikai. That's not the point. Suzuki-san, it's not your fighting prowess that's in question. The Fujiwara took your clan members as slaves, so you were in the right to retaliate. But the Hojo has done nothing to you, so it would be an unprovoked attack coming from you, and it could very well turn into a clan war. Hidaki was right. He came here to prevent a war, not instigate one. Wasn't this the exact same issue Yoruichi and Kisuke had talked about all those years ago? Something about how Kaien had gotten too close to uncovering Aizen, and the entire Shiba clan, every man, woman, child, retainer, servant, paid for it. Given what he knew about Hojo Takamasa, he couldn't imagine his clan being any less thorough. The group fell into a solemn sort of silence, everyone glancing furtively around at each other for ideas. Hidaki, Suzuki asked. Hidaki flinched at being called out, and then waved his hands frantically. Don't ask me. This situation is so out of my experience that there's nothing. No, not that, Suzuki interrupted. What I wanted to know is, as a retainer yourself, if one of the Nakatomi offends another clan so as to do the right thing, would you still stand by them? I guess. Hidaki paused to think. Yes, okay. He could work with that. Oi, Minamoto. A squeak of alarm came from behind a tree, and a head popped out. Wait, Akira said slowly. Isn't that the guy who's been following you around? Suzuki might not know much about Soul Society, but he was one of the best students in Karakura High, and that meant he actually knew his history. If the Shihoin were unaffected by the machinations of the Hojo clan, well, the Minamoto clan was another matter altogether. Judging from the way the noble houses fought to hang on to the power they had enjoyed while alive, Suzuki wouldn't be surprised if the Minamoto held a grudge against the Hojo, given that Hojo Takamasa had ended their entire line to steal control of the Kamakura shogunate. What do you think? Will your clan go for it? The Minamoto kid, who'd been following him around ever since Suzuki made a fool of his father on the second day of school, straightened from his flailing, his noble mask sliding back on like they hadn't just seen him stumbling out from behind a tree. I cannot speak for my clan as a whole, he admitted candidly, but my family would support your efforts, Shihoin-san. Why? Tozen demanded, glaring at him suspiciously. What makes you think your family wouldn't take their side? Minamoto's eyebrow twitched violently, but his tone was level when he said, because I am Minamoto Ikemoto, son of Minamoto no Ikemen. It wasn't a name Suzuki recognized. Grandson of Minamoto no Yori, great-grandson of Minamoto no Yoritomo. Ikemoto's face was completely expressionless. My father was 6 years old when Hojo Takamasa murdered him. Well, that changed things. Tozen was jittery throughout their entire afternoon class, and even Suzuki had to admit to paying less attention than usual. Now that all of you have received your Asachi, Onabora began. We will be going through basic hand signals and patrol protocols in preparation for your first upcoming patrol. Suzuki flipped open the booklet being passed down through the aisles, browsing the contents idly. After that first mission with the Fujiwara, Kisuke had made sure he was fluent in hand signals, so this should. Wait, he didn't recognize a good 1/4 of these signs. Even the ones he did recognize, around half of them were slightly different from the ones he'd learnt. But Suzuki had had no trouble communicating with other Onmitsukido members on missions, which meant the standard Shinigami hand signs were different from the Onmitsukido ones. We will be holding tests weekly, and the winner after 4 weeks will be the patrol leader for this class. Onabora signed something with his hands, too fast and foreign for Suzuki to read. He resisted the urge, put his head on the table. Great, if he lost this, he was really going to get it from Kisuke and Yoruichi. The Hojo lived on the outskirts of Serete, a fair distance away from the Godai. Even with Shunpo, it took them a good hour, not the least because they could only move at Minamoto Ikemoto's pace. Minamoto Ikemoto and Shihoin Suzuki, here to pay our respects to Hojo Takatoki Dono. Ikemoto informed the gate guards. It had been decided that Ikemoto would do most of the talking, while Suzuki effected his best aloof noble impression. The guards bowed back slightly, and one of them left to announce their presence. Not long after, he reappeared at the gates, gesturing for them to enter. This way, please. They followed the guard through a dizzying array of stone paths, winding through more gardens than Suzuki could keep up with, until they finally stopped in front of a delicate-looking pavilion. My lord will be with you in a moment, the guard said, showing them to their cushions and pouring them each a cup of tea before he left. Suzuki and Ikemoto exchanged a look, and made no move to touch the tea. It was a long while before an elderly man entered the pavilion, leaning heavily on his cane. Suzuki didn't recognize him, but Ikemoto fell into a full formal greeting immediately. Hojo Takamasa Dono. Takamasa. Suzuki had been under the impression that they were waiting for Takatoki, not the clan head himself. We heard about the unfortunate demise of Takatoki Dono's beautiful wife, and would like to offer our condolences that such a gentle beauty was taken from him so soon. Ikemoto bowed again, getting up to offer his cushion to Takamasa. Ah, yes, unfortunate indeed. Takamasa refused both the cushion and the tea that Suzuki had instinctively offered him, which did not make it seem any less suspicious. I'm afraid dear Takatoki-kun is indisposed in his grief at the moment. Given that Tozen had just seen Takatoki swagger into a bar the previous night, boisterous and arrogant, Suzuki had serious doubts as to the veracity of that claim. Takamasa gave a long, regretful sigh, looking for all the world like a weary grandfather. He should never have permitted the girl to join the Shinigami. He shook his head, gazed distant. But alas, love makes fools of us all. As though suddenly remembering that they were still there, Takamasa gestured at the cushions. Since Takatoki-kun is unable to receive visitors at the moment, please accept our poor hospitality on his behalf. He rang a bell, and a young woman slipped silently into the pavilion, bearing a tea service. This is Yoshiko, a daughter of my line, Takamasa introduced. The young woman smiled faintly, hiding her face behind one of her long sleeves. Please, feel free to rest after your long journey. Yoshiko bowed silently as Takamasa stumped out of the pavilion. Turning to the two of them, she set the tea service down in front of Suzuki, and then retreated out of the pavilion to presumably fetch another tray. We should go, Ikemoto said the moment they were alone again, his mouth pressed into a grim line. We're not going to accomplish anything else here. Suzuki wholeheartedly agreed, getting up from his cushion. If Takatoki wasn't going to turn up, there was no need for them to stay any longer. Something was buzzing under his skin, like a nerve stretched taut. He had a feeling they'd overstayed their welcome. As though summoned by their imminent departure, Yoshiko reappeared, hurrying along the path with another tea service in her hands. "Ah, honored guests, please," she cried out, eyes widening in shock. "Please forgive us for our poor hospitality, but we sincerely hope." Suzuki tuned the rest of her sentence out. This was far too much for some basic hospitality. It looked almost as if she were trying to stall them for some reason. Ikemoto seemed to get the same impression at the same time. Run! They careened down the nearest path, ignoring the shouts erupting all around them. Suzuki snagged Ikemoto's sleeve before he could barrel into a squad of men running in their direction, pressing both of them against a pillar. "We need to get out of here before they have the chance to get into position," he whispered into Ikemoto's ear. "Yeah." Ikemoto's eyes were wild, his gaze swinging around. "But which way is the exit?" Suzuki bit back a curse. Those paths earlier, so they were meant to confuse them. Hojo Takamasa had never intended to let them leave, had he? And if Suzuki hadn't been trained by Kisuke, he would have succeeded. The gates are that way. He might not have been able to remember all the winding paths they took to get to the pavilion, but Suzuki had never lost track of the direction where the main entrance lay. They ran down a few more paths, but none of them seemed to be going in the direction Suzuki wanted them to. "Ah, Shihoin-san, Minamoto-san, what a pity, you should have taken the offer." Hojo Takamasa was standing in their way, a bevy of archers arrayed out behind him. He looked nothing like the kindly grandfather he did earlier. Now he was in full armor, his stance strong and sure, like a commander of the Genpei War. Suzuki put a hand on his Zanpakuto. "Don't draw," Ikemoto hissed, his own fists clenching and unclenching. "Don't give them a chance to claim its self-defense." Running footsteps and clanking armor from behind them alerted Suzuki to the fact that they were surrounded. He spared a glance backwards, noting that at least the archers were only in front of him. Hojo Takamasa shook his head mock sadly, the last of his grandfatherly facade fading away. "So be it." He raised a hand, and the archers readied their arrows. "Get behind me," Suzuki barked at the same time. If he couldn't draw his sword, well, at least both his arm bracers were solid metal. Fire, arrows rend the sky like rain, but they were simple wood and metal, fired by people who might as well be civilians. And Suzuki might be many things, but civilian hadn't been one of them for a long, long time. In this new body, he wasn't hollow enough to call up a Hyro anymore, but he was also no longer constrained by the reaction speed of a regular human. Suzuki batted the first arrow aside, choosing to only deflect the ones that had a chance of hitting him. It would have been no trouble for him to dodge all of them, but Suzuki spun out from the last wave of arrows, threw Ikemoto unceremoniously over his shoulder, and jumped. There was shouting coming from behind. No, below him now, but he'd timed it right when the archers had run out of arrows and were forced to reload. Another Ryatsu fueled leap put him on the roof of the next building, and Suzuki sped into his fastest shunpo, headed directly for where the main gates lay. If the paths were going to lead them into ambushes, well, whoever said there was only one way to get to his destination? He spared a glance back, just enough to reassure himself that there wasn't anyone chasing him over the rooftops. The gates were unmanned, a fatal mistake. Suzuki jumped down from the roof of the nearest house, making a beeline for the gates. He could still faintly hear shouting in the distance, coming close enough that he almost ripped the gate off its hinges in his haste to get it open. "Where to now?" he demanded, squeezing out of the gate the moment there was a gap wide enough for him to get through. Ikemoto raised an arm weakly to point, and without another word Suzuki bolted in that direction. He didn't stop until the walls of another compound came into view, and even then he would have continued if it was not for Ikemoto frantically tapping his shoulder, gesturing that he wanted to be let down. Ikemoto looked rather green, clutching at the trunk of a nearby tree for support, and Suzuki politely turned away while Ikemoto staggered behind the tree to throw up. "Sorry," he said gruffly. Ikemoto waved an arm, although it was more like a flail. "You saved my life, some nausea is nothing." When he stepped out from behind the tree again, his face was still shockingly pale, but he didn't look injured. "This is my family's compound, we'll be safe here." "The Minamoto?" Suzuki asked, looking up at the sprawling estate. True, it did resemble the Fujiwara estate somewhat, although he couldn't really tell from the outside. Ikemoto hesitated slightly. "My family lives with the Hiki, actually. The main Minamoto compound is over there." He pointed further into the distance, where Suzuki could just barely make out another compound. Suzuki decided against asking Ikemoto about it, and took him up on the invitation to rest for a while. At least Ikemoto wouldn't be trying to kill him. He made sure to remember the route to the main gate just in case. "Ikemoto Dono, a summons to the Minamoto has come for you and your honored guest." Ikemoto put his cup of tea down, the liquid sloshing over the sides. The look he sent Suzuki was wild-eyed. "Tell the messenger that we will be there shortly," he informed the servant, who bowed and exited the room. "So, do we have a chance of convincing your clan?" Suzuki asked, though by the expression on Ikemoto's face he already knew the answer. "Still, we're already here. We won't gain anything if we don't try." If the Hojo had contacted the Minamoto, then it stood to reason that they had also contacted the Shihoin. It was probably the Minamoto clan's proximity to the two of them right now that let their messenger arrive first. Suzuki wasn't naive. He knew the noble clans had no reason to go on a crusade just for Tozen's friend. Knew that Rukendai citizens were seen more as worthless trash and less as actual people, but just because it was difficult or commonplace didn't make it right. Maybe if Yoruichi or Kisuke was here, they would try to talk him out of it. This didn't have anything to do with Aizen's grand plan after all. But if he didn't do what was right, if he lost what made him him in the pursuit of victory against Aizen, then what was the point of coming back in time? The trip into the Minamoto compound was much shorter than the Hojo one, despite the Minamoto compound being far bigger, further strengthening Suzuki's suspicions that the Hojo had been trying to turn them around on purpose. "Tsunemoto-sama," Ikemoto murmured, getting down into a formal greeting. Minamoto no Tsunemoto was an elderly man just like Hojo Takamasa, except he didn't pretend to be a harmless old man. "Ikemoto," he snapped. "Explain yourself." Ikemoto stuttered through an explanation about how they had only gone to offer Takatoki their condolences over the demise of his wife. But Tsunemoto was unmoved. "Do you take me for a fool, boy?" he thundered. "Any witless monkey can see that Takatoki probably killed the girl himself." Suzuki bit down on his tongue so hard he tasted blood. Shouting at Tsunemoto, as good as it would feel, wasn't going to accomplish anything except get him attacked for the second time in 2 hours. And he wouldn't ordinarily care, except this would mean Hojo Takatoki would walk free for what he had done, and every fiber in his being refused to let that stand. But how was he going to make Tsunemoto understand? "Tsunemoto-sama, with no one to oppose the Hojo, their ego will only rampage unchecked, until the tragedies of the Kamakura shogunate repeat themselves. That is hardly our problem." Tsunemoto leaned back in his seat, steepling his fingers. "What happened in the transient world is already centuries past. Your father is alive and well in Soul Society. There is no value in dragging it up again." His eyes flickered to Suzuki, who was still standing to one side. "The shogunate, the military, in this world, they will never belong to us nor to the Hojo." "With all due respect, Tsunemoto-sama," Suzuki said through gritted teeth, "the Godai has no jurisdiction over the crimes of an individual clan. Therefore justice can only be served by the collaborative efforts of the other clans." "But as you have just said, Shihoin-san," Tsunemoto pointed out, "it is the internal affairs of another clan." To breach the autonomy of a clan for such a trivial matter would undermine the existence. There is nothing trivial about a life. Enough. Ikemoto jumped at the sound, not that Suzuki could blame him. It was like a thunderclap had just gone off in the room. Half the candles blew out in an invisible wind, throwing the room into eerie shadow. Get out. But, get out. Tsunemoto's face was half lit by the candlelight, his features distorting into something monstrous. Well, life is not a trivial affair. The height of hypocrisy coming from an attack dog, Shihoin-san. Suzuki opened his mouth to retort, but Ikemoto practically dragged him out of the door, bowing frantically as he went. What? He demanded. Ikemoto's eyes were huge in his face, his skin as pale as it had been when they were running for their lives from the Hojo. Shihoin Dono, please don't incite. Is everything all right? Ikemoto jumped, clapping a hand over his mouth to muffle the tiny squeak he let out. Oh, my most sincere apologies, Hiramasa Dono. He hastily swept into a bow, less formally than Tsunemoto but still more deeply than Suzuki would have expected, given that this Hiramasa looked to be a young man in his late 20s. Age was difficult to calculate in Seoul society, but appearance was generally a useful indicator, and Hiramasa also didn't hold himself with the air of a powerful man. Not like Hojo Takamasa or Minamoto no Tsunemoto. Hiramasa returned the greeting, looking anxiously at the meeting hall they had just exited from. I heard the sound of thunder, he said, almost to himself. What has upset Tsunemoto Dono thus? He was dressed in plain layered robes of scarlet and black, with no armaments that Suzuki could see, not unless one counted the flute tucked into his sash, and the biwa slung over his back like a guitar. Musician. That flute couldn't possibly be a zanpakuto, could it? It had an interesting little tassel attached to one end, some kind of gemstone that glowed faintly with an inner, almost hypnotizing light. Suzuki tore his gaze away from the tassel when Ikemoto launched into a recount of the events again, but this time offering the real reason as to why they were visiting the Hojo, not the polite fiction they had given the clan heads. Did he have reason to think Hiramasa could do something to help? Hiramasa clasped his hands together, looking so distraught that Suzuki actually felt a little bad for telling him. He didn't come across them often, but he was aware that there were people who were sheltered by their clans their whole lives, like the little Princess Kasumioji Rurichio had been. Oh, the poor lady, Hiramasa whispered, his eyes glistening like he was about to start crying at any moment. And therefore, Hojo Takatoki cannot be allowed to get away with such travesty. Suzuki eyed Ikemoto dubiously. Oi, was this all right? Or was Ikemoto just trying to get someone on his side so that they had more allies against the Hojo? Perhaps Minamoto Hiramasa was the head of a large branch family, or had some other political influence. Of course, Hiramasa agreed with no hesitation, turning to wave at someone who was approaching them. Oh, Seimei. Seimei was another man dressed in white robes over a royal blue palette, although Suzuki couldn't pin down his age. Somehow, despite his youthful features, there was something ageless about him. He was also carrying a blue and white fan that matched his robes, swishing it gently through the air as he walked, though Suzuki didn't really understand its purpose. If he was so hot, why was he wearing so many layers? Abe-sama, choked Ikemoto in a strangled voice, offering a truncated version of the same formal greeting he had given the clan heads earlier. Even though he had never heard of an Abe-sama before, Suzuki figured he had better follow suit with a formal greeting himself. He was clearly somebody important, and they probably needed all the allies they could get at this point. The Abe clan was pretty big too, he supposed, although not as prominent as the Minamoto or the Fujiwara. My dear Hiramasa, what has caused you such distress? Suzuki felt a strange chill run down his spine. Although the words were clearly directed at Hiramasa, Seimei's eyes bored unblinking into the two of them. But he also didn't look angry. If he had to put a word to it, Suzuki would say he looked disinterested. Seimei, we have to do something for the poor lady. Hiramasa was chattering away, either not realizing or not caring that Seimei didn't seem to be paying attention to him. Seimei snapped his fan shut, tapping it idly against the palm of his other hand. Must we? Certainly, Hiramasa cried, but Suzuki had enough. First the Central 46, then Takamasa, then Tsunemoto, and now yet another noble was dismissing the fact that somebody had died. Hey, you. A hand covered his mouth before he could finish his sentence. Suzuki instinctively struggled against the hold before he suddenly recognized the Ryatsu, and went limp in surprise. What in the world was Kisuke doing here? Seimei Dono, Chashikayo Dono, please accept this humble personage's most sincere apologies for my ward's unbecoming behavior. Please rest assured that he will receive an appropriate punishment. Lord Autumn was that Hiramasa's title, And what was this about? Actually, what was going on? Seime's dispassionate stare left Suzuki, transferring to Kisuke instead. A flicker of interest entered his gaze, his eyes traveling lower too. Was he looking at Benayam? Hiramasa, he sighed, and finally turned to look at his companion. The steady tap-tap of his fan against his palm stilling. What a good man you are. Hiramasa beamed, bright and apparently completely oblivious. We'll have to talk more about this matter next time, then. Kisuke's grip on Suzuki tightened, like he wanted to ensure Suzuki couldn't say another word. He forced them into a stiff bow and then dragged him out of the gates, ignoring how Ikemoto trailed behind them. He didn't let go of Suzuki until the Minamoto compound was no longer visible in the distance and Ikemoto had long left for his own home, and even then it was to transfer his grip onto Suzuki's shoulder, bruisingly tight. Suzuki sneaked a glance at the profile of his face. He didn't know what he was expecting, but Kisuke didn't look angry, at least, no, he looked almost worried. If it had been anyone else, Suzuki would have ventured to guess he was afraid. What's going on? He demanded. Kisuke shook his head, quickening his steps. Suki-chan, you've really made a lot of trouble for us. Sorry, Suzuki muttered. So the Hojo had indeed contacted the Shihoin too, then, and Yoruichi had chosen to send Kisuke instead of a normal messenger. But we didn't attack anybody in the Hojo compound, we just refused to drink the tea and ran out. That answer didn't seem to placate Kisuke. What were you doing at the Minamoto's, then? Minamoto Ikemoto-san should be living with his maternal relatives. There was a summons from the Minamoto clan head. Suzuki explained, finally understanding why Minamoto Ikemoto's home was in the Hiki compound. So we had to go over to explain ourselves. Then when we came out, we ran into that Hiramasa dude. He asked what happened, so Ikemoto started explaining, but then that Seime guy got upset for some reason. Minamoto-san was trying to convince some powerful allies for your case against Hojo Takatoki-san. But what were you doing? He was being completely dismissive of the fact that somebody died, like he didn't care. That's your reason for offending him. Kisuke gave him a very strange look. Suzuki, please, next time use your head before you talk. It may be important to you, but why would Seime Dono care about the life of a human? Suzuki was about to rebut when the phrasing caught his attention. Of a human? You make it sound like he's not human. Kisuke stopped so suddenly that Suzuki almost tripped. You have no idea who that was, do you? His words were not a question. Does your transient world schools not teach you about Abe no Seime and Minamoto no Hiramasa? Ooh. Suzuki scrunched up his face. Some guy from the Heian era. And what do you mean, powerful allies? Hiramasa looks like he isn't even 30, and Seime not that much older. If they still look that young after so many centuries in Soul Society, it means they had to have died really young, right? Kisuke shook his head slowly, like he was bemoaning the lack of education in the human world. It probably didn't even occur to Minamoto-san that you weren't aware, he muttered to himself. Not that he could have warned you in any case, since Seime Dono would already have been within hearing distance by that time. He let go of Suzuki's shoulder so that he could look Suzuki in the eyes. Suzuki, he paused, and then carefully stressed, Ichigo, if you wish to live to see Aizen defeated, then perhaps offending the last living nine-tailed kitsune in 3 worlds is not a good idea. Suzuki stared at him, but Kisuke didn't look like he was joking. There are kitsune in Soul Society, he yelped. Kisuke frowned, but obligingly switched back to speaking aloud as well. You are aware that Kamamura Teicho comes from a clan of werewolves, yes. His voice was slanting towards exasperated now. Why are you so surprised there are kitsune? Kamamura was a what? Kisuke started to say something, and then cut himself off with an impatient shake of his head. Never mind, it's not important at this moment. Just make sure that if you ever see Seime Dono again, be polite and never upset Hiramasa Dono. Is he a kitsune too? Suzuki asked, following behind Kisuke as they began walking towards the academy once more. Hiramasa Dono. No, he used to be fully human. Kisuke paused thoughtfully. I do not think even he himself knows what he is now. So that flute, it is a Zanpakuto. Of a sort, Kisuke agreed. I am sure the history lessons in the academy has covered this. The Zanpakuto was the invention of Nimaya Otsu Teicho in the early days of the Gotai. Suzuki nodded along. Then, have you considered, before the invention of the Zanpakuto, what did people fight with? Suzuki made a noise of understanding. Minamoto no Hiramasa was one of the most accomplished imperial court musicians in the transient world. Even in life, his music was said to have been so enchanting that he could dance unscathed through a demon parade. In fact, the 2 instruments you saw him carrying, the flute and the biwa, they were both gifts from demons while he still lived in the transient world. Suzuki wanted to ask about the demons too. But, what do you mean, while he still lived in the transient world? He's not dead. The Heian period was almost a full millennium ago. Kisuke shot him a glance. As far as the censors in Soul Society can tell, Seimedono brought him over still alive. Caused a huge uproar in the Godai a few centuries back when he first came to Soul Society. But even the Sateicho was wary about going up against a nine-tailed kitsune and an immortal who could charm even the guardians of hell. He stopped, and with a start Suzuki realized they were at the entrance of the academy. "Stay here." Kisuke tipped his head back, staring up at the sky. He looked very, very tired. "We'll sort things out with the other clans." The next morning, there was a new posting on the job board. Yoruichi's note on the job board. Suzuki's eyebrow twitched. "I received a very interesting Jigokucho from Onabora today." Yoruichi began the moment dinner was cleared away, and Suzuki just barely managed to resist the temptation to slam his head repeatedly into the table at the sight of the wide smirk upon her face. The smirk widened, as though Yoruichi could sense what was going on through his head. "So, starting from tomorrow, you'll be coming home every weekend to train with a Zanpakuto. Isn't this brilliant?" Yoruichi crowed, clapping her hands together gleefully. The smirk changed slightly, revealing a hint of the special brand of sadism Suzuki knew she possessed in spades. First-hand knowledge from getting his ass kicked around in what she called training almost every day for the past 4 years. His life flashing before his eyes, Suzuki did the only thing anybody would do in that situation. He whimpered. Training, as all the Shihoin students knew, was just an excuse for their sadistic trainers to come up with new ways to torture them in the name of education. The smirk on Yoruichi's face confirmed that. "We'll start off with a warm-up, 40 laps around the track, and make sure you avoid all the traps this time." For a moment, Suzuki could only stop and stare at her. 40 laps as a warm-up. Or shall I make it 50? Yoruichi grinned evilly, and Suzuki gulped before beginning his run. He hastily swerved as the wooden panel in front of him suddenly glowed blue, narrowly avoided a jet of scalding water to his right, and jumped over another rigged panel just as it released a shower of shrapnel. It was going to be a long 40 laps. As a reward for doing so well, apparently, Yoruichi had given him a day off. He had been happy up until the moment she told him, with an evil smirk on her face, to dress appropriately as the host of a full tea ceremony at noon. "It'll be Hakobai style, Tsuki-chan," she told him gleefully, and Suzuki groaned out loud. Of course she would pick one of the more annoying styles. At least she didn't invite the Elders' Council to attend. That would have been even more troublesome. Suzuki would rather have run another 40 laps instead of serving tea to them. Taking a deep breath, Suzuki exited the tea house, where he had been getting everything ready. He sprinkled water outside the door and re-entered, remembering to leave the door ajar. He walked into the waiting room, double-checked everything was in its place, and continued on to wait in the preparation area. Barely half an hour later, Suzuki felt a swift flash of Ryatsu in the guest room, signifying Yoruichi's presence. He stifled a sigh as he sprinkled more water around the garden, then performed the purification ritual. When he looked up, she had already exited the waiting room, and they exchanged silent bows. There was a faint, innocent smile tugging at the corner of her lips. He knew that look. Cursing inwardly, he waited impatiently for her to glide back into the waiting room and the sliding door to close fully before breaking into a Shunpo-aided run. From past experience, he knew that she would take approximately 7 minutes to complete her part of the ceremonial rituals, 5 if she was feeling particularly sadistic. And that innocent smile suggested that she was feeling rather sadistic that day. Faced with a choice between preserving his dignity and encountering Yoruichi, Suzuki ran for his life. He had barely closed the door to the preparation room, silently gasping for breath, when he heard the door to the tea room lock with a click. Holding a hand to his chest, thank Kami-sama, he had barely made it. He bent over for a few moments to steady his breathing. After taking another minute to compose himself, he rose smoothly and entered the tea room. Yoruichi was already perusing the shelf. He was pretty sure performing Heiken that fast was borderline illegal, but there was no way he would say that to her face, and turned to exchange the proper salutations with him. "I would like to offer you a simple meal," Suzuki stated, sliding backwards out of the room. Back in the preparation room, he took another breath to calm himself down, taking the first tray that the servants had already brought from the kitchen. At least Yoruichi did not ask him to run to the kitchen and get it himself. There was no way he could do that within the time limit. Finally, after over an hour, the kaiseki meal was complete. Suzuki wanted to keel over and die. If Yoruichi noticed, and he was fairly sure she did, her expression did not change during their well-rehearsed ritual conversations. The hardest part, in Suzuki's private opinion, came next. Since it was summer, the ritual for the filling of charcoal was only after the formal meal. Giving Yoruichi a glance, Suzuki knew without her saying that she was expecting him to perform a gazumi as well. Just his luck. The charcoal refill was a ritual that required much skill and experience. During the initial filling of charcoal, the pieces must be laid in an exact manner such that the fire would go out at the right time. Careful estimation of the length of time the fire would burn was needed, by factoring in conditions like airflow and the formation of the ash. What made the whole thing worse was that the host had no control over how much time the guests would take for each portion of the ceremony, since there were some optional rituals the guests may choose to initiate. Suzuki gave the tea preparation utensils another glance, rapidly considering which ones Yoruichi was likely to discuss, before coming to an abrupt decision. He could only hope he was right. What followed next could only be termed a pop quiz, as Yoruichi immediately asked about all except 2 of the tea utensils laid out. Suzuki answered to the best of his ability, explaining the story behind each item, and offering interesting details when he could remember them. It was a good thing that most of what he picked out consisted of items that he had practiced with before. It was with relief that he served the sweet and called the break, as much for himself as it was for the guests. Sweeping and airing out the tea room already came instinctively to him, and his practiced hands laid out the flower arrangement he had been forced to learn by heart. Giving the charcoal brazier a nervous glance, he steeled his nerves and rung the gong to signal that he was ready. The difficult parts were almost over. Moments later, he heard the door open. Exiting the preparation room, he ritually cleansed each utensil and placed them in the prescribed order. Methodically, he whisked the thick tea into perfection, bowing to Yoruichi as he served it. She accepted the bowl from him with a bow, raised it in a gesture of respect to him, rotated it and took a sip. After complimenting him on the tea with a standard phrase, she took a few more sips, wiped the rim of the bowl clean and returned it to him. The fire chose to sputter out right at that moment, and Suzuki heaved a sigh of relief inwardly. Ideally, it should have gone out the moment he finished preparing the tea, but at least it did not choose to do so, say, in the midst of his preparation. That would have been a faux pas of the highest order. Adding more charcoal, he left the room to procure cushions and more confections. With a similar ritual exchange, the thin tea was served, signifying the end of the formal portion of the tea ceremony. Relaxing minutely, Suzuki winced as the ghost of an amused smile flitted across Yoruichi's face, right before she began inquiring politely as to his training schedule. And suddenly, it was all over. Murmuring the standard farewell, Suzuki stood in front of the tea room, a frozen smile on his face, until Yoruichi had passed out of his line of sight. Striding woodenly to the door, he shut it firmly, and then collapsed in a heap on the floor. The door flung open. "Suki-chan," called Yoruichi with a sing-song voice. "Let's go over that, shall we?" Suzuki rolled over and moaned. "What did I do to deserve this?" he asked the ceiling rhetorically. Yoruichi's upside-down face appeared in his vision. "For giving Kisuke so much extra work to do," she said tartly. "He hasn't even sat down to meditate for past 2 days." Suzuki winced, but he stood his ground stubbornly. "But it's the right thing," Yoruichi groaned. "You should have talked to one of us first. At least we could have stopped you from challenging a 9-tailed kitsune." She shook her head in exasperation. "Kisuke's probably already trying to make you a denrei shinki as we speak, as if he needs any more work on top of this political mess." Suzuki rolled into a sitting position, but she held up a hand before he could say anything. "Don't apologize to me, tell him yourself when you see him. And next time, call. Hey, Rose, did you hear about something big's going down with the noble clans? You remember that unseated member in Shiba's squad who didn't show up one day, and the husband claims she was killed by a hollow on her way home? Yeah, I call bullshit. There weren't any hollows near that area that day, and her Zanpakuto wasn't even unsheathed. Well, apparently the other noble clans are taking offense to that blatant lie. About time. Thank you for watching. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a video. And comment down your opinion on this video. Thanks for stopping by and I'll see you in the next one.